Whispers of a World Breaker. Elmirian Book 1. Elmirian Chronicles. Written by Corey Ratliff. Narrated by Jez Sands. Chapter 1. The Misty Scar. Auric Telendris stared at the ebony sword in his hand, no longer certain if it was forged with such colour, or if the black blood of orcs had stained it over the past 16 years. He was knelt in a northeastern trench, broadsword clutched in one hand, an iron cup in the other. His raven locks, speared and garb jutting out from beneath black chainmail, were drenched with the evermist that encompassed the misty scar. He, along with 24 other sentinels, was on guard. At that moment, they were at ease, resting more than they were ready for battle. And yet, they were always battle-ready. "They're late," said Captain Francel, a man with eyes the hue of sun-touched spruce. Though he'd always denied it, most of the sentinels had come to the conclusion he was a half-ern, a half-human, half-elf. Auric looked toward the haze above and listened. It was as silent as it had been for weeks. "They're never this late, sir." Francel gripped the onyx handle of a dagger on his belt, his leather gloves groaning. "Maybe. Schedules are never set in stone." After a moment of pulsating jaw muscles, he took a deep breath. "Something has to be wrong." "Something's always wrong, sir," muttered Tanan Greyfern. The scout for the sentinels was lying above on the ground beside the trench. His role was to keep the eyes open and the mouth shut until something breached the mist on the horizon. He was never great at the latter part of his job. "Damn it, Tanan," growled Morrow, a hazel-skinned man with too many daggers for a normal man to carry. "Shut the hell up unless you see something out there. You do realize we train ourselves to hear a scout's voice over almost everyone." "In the squad," said Tanan, interrupting Morrow tauntingly. "You realize you tell me this every time I speak? And you—" "Enough," hissed Francel. Auric fought a smirk by taking a sip of the ice-cold water in his mug. The chill of the liquid ran down his throat and into his empty stomach, sending a shiver up his spine. Standing, he shoved the sword into his back sheath. "Want us to run reconnaissance, sir?" Francel rubbed the grey stubble on his chin and exhaled slowly through his nostrils. His eyes were downcast for a long moment before he looked at Auric. "That may be a good idea." "It would be," said Calder, the youngest on the squad, "if we knew which exact direction the court was coming from." "Honestly," said a bulbous man with a thick red moustache. He grunted and stood. His heft was a mixture of his heavy stature and unnatural height, which could rival small orcs. "Why are we down here in the muck, doing this day after day, waiting for the court to show up? Most times off schedule and unannounced." "We've already been through this, Maddock," said Auric. He shook his head and rolled his eyes. The same conversations that riddled the sentinels became a bore at best. Most days the deafening silence of the misty scar was welcomed. They hadn't seen anyone besides the squad in weeks. They hadn't moved from the northeastern trench. There was no battle to be fought this time round. They simply waited. The anxiousness of the deployment had worn off by the 4th or 5th day. "So the elves can build a rich city on the southeast, and one of the most fortified cities in the northwest. Yet here we are," said Maddock. He lifted his arms out to the side and slowly turned in a circle as he spoke. "They ran and protected Virilia for millennia. Yet now their previous dragons are depleted. They grovel at the heels of man to serve their cause." "Solid hope the dragons will return," said Francel. "It's a good cause, Maddock. Only dragon mages can stave off the orcs for so long." Auric took in the last of his water and tossed the mug down. He shifted to readjust his armour on his shoulders. "He does have a point, sir." "Not you too," said Franzel sardonically. We live in peace, if this is what you can call peace, said Arik, gesturing to the trench that was their home. And that is only from the threat of dragon mages. You know as well as we all do that Bor Masari just puts out the word there is a new dragon mage every year. You don't believe them, said Morrow as he furrowed his thick brows. Not for a second, Arik said dryly. He bent down and picked up his mail gloves. You and I have been on the Elven court for 16 years, almost half of my life. Dragons grow rapidly, right? If there were as many hatched as they've told the world, told Powerless anyway, we'd have a sky full of dragon mages again. He looked up, sarcastically searching with his hand cupped around his eyes. Nope, the sky is quiet. Aye, said Tanan. I don't believe it for a second either. Powerless doesn't have to listen to the elves. He has an army strong enough to keep the orcs at bay if they attack the citadel of Greyhorn itself. Arik narrowed his eyes. Really, kid. Greyhorn is on the opposite side of Varilla as Asgrim. By the time any orc army made it to Greyhorn, it would be grinded down to a weak shell of its initial glory. Powerless isn't worried. Why this same mule shit again and again? A short man in plate armor asked. His thick red hair was pulled back into a half ponytail, braided to match his beard. It's not like there's anything else to talk about, Brelin, said Morrow. Politics, religion, and war, Brelin said with a scoff. They're all I ever fucking hear about, and only one of those things are any of us actually good at. He snorted and looked around. There is one other thing I'm quite good at, but no. He half sat up and shook his head with a grimace. We aren't allowed to have them in the trenches with us anymore. Arik's stomach churned. You're as much of a monster as the orcs if you're seriously bitching about that, Brelin. Lay your ass back down and go to sleep. Brelin sat up all the way and drew a long dagger from his boot. Or what, Arik? Going to shut me up like you did the kid last season? Arik didn't move, but his mind and muscle memory had him on the edge of reaching for one of the two ebony blades on his back. If it falls on the same topic, then yeah. Shut the fuck up, Brelin, said Morrow. He gestured at Arik. He did the right thing. What if that would have been one of your kin getting raped? Brelin shrugged and nonchalantly slid his dagger back into its sheath. Such is the life of war dogs. We eat, we breathe, we breed, we fight, and then we die. Arik clenched his fists, the chainmail covering his gloves digging into his palms. He kept his eyes on Brelin. Sir, permission to remove this filth from our trench. Denied, said Franzel. He glared sideways at Brelin. Another word about your manhood yearning for something more, and I'll remove it and shove it up your trench. Is that understood? Brelin's eyes widened. He glanced at the captain, then at Arik. Is that understood? Brelin cleared his throat. Clearly, sir. He shot another quick glance at Arik and rolled his eyes. Arik shook his head and sighed. As much excitement as a scuffle would be at the moment, he knew Brelin was a competent fighter. The squad would be down one less man. How about that recon, sir? Take Morrow, Calder, and Maddock with you, said Franzel. Travel towards Valensmere. At least we know where the eggs are coming from. Once you've reached the edge of the scar and have a semblance of open vision across the plain, fan out no more than 500 paces. Arik nodded at Morrow, then looked at Calder. While the youngest sentinel would have been his last choice, he knew they all needed the experience, and thus Franzel left it up to him and the other two to educate the kid. He looked at Maddock, whose sideways stare at Calder showed a similar unsettlement. Ready? Absolutely. Maddock jeered, his face shifting in a flash to a smile. Get me the hell out of this ditch for a bit. Arik led the reconnaissance team up the rope ladder, just behind Tanan. He paused at the top and tapped the scout's boot. "If you see anything, alert the captain," said Tanan with a dryness of annoyance. "I know how to do my job, thanks." Arik shook his head and climbed onto the soft ground. He drew both of his swords slowly and squinted into the grey mist before him. While it was ever present, on this day, clouds must have been shrouding the sun, for the wall before him was denser than usual. "Damn it," he hissed. Glancing over his shoulder, he whispered, "Roll your feet when you walk. Full stealth until we're out of the thick of the fog. Watch for sticks and rocks. Keep your ears open as much as your eyes." The other three nodded as they drew their weapons. Morrow held a dagger in each hand. Calder awkwardly carried a broadsword, and Maddock carried a longsword, resting it on his shoulder. Together they moved as a single unit, something Arik and Morrow had practiced together for years. As they walked silently, Arik kept his eyes darting back and forth, then to the sky and back down. The pattern was repeated as his chest became tight. Any silhouette could be friend or foe, but in the misty scar, few were friendly outside of the trenches. After nearly 20 minutes of creeping, the mist thinned out. The dark patch of the horizon came into view. Arik held up his fist, halting the team. He scanned the ground again, then the sky. Nearly a half-minute passed as the squad scanned their perimeter. "All right, spread out," he said quietly. "Wait until everyone is set before you move forward. Keep your eyes up. Foul ravs are as silent up there as we are down here." His words were mostly for Calder. Morrow had as much experience as he did. Calder was the first to set. He gave a single high-pitched whistle that resembled a starling's call. Morrow whistled second, then Maddock gave his signal. Arik whistled a longer note, crescendoing to a higher pitch. Continuing the stealth technique of stepping heel to ball, he moved again. He carefully slid one of his swords back into the X-shaped sheath on his back. While two were often superior for blocking, they were the enemy of finesse and practicality in a duel. The outskirts of the misty scar were no less bleak than the dead trenches. The air clung thick with the rot of damp soil, or the leafless trees frozen in time. But Arik had to pay more attention to his footfalls now, as brittle rocks riddled the dirt. Careful and slow were his breaths. Another 10 minutes of quiet steps passed. Then a jolt of adrenaline was sent to Arik's heart as something whooshed by ahead. He halted and widened his eyes. The dark shadow darted behind a thick, lifeless pine. "Fuck," he thought, as he gripped his sword tighter. Should have brought a bow. Clenching his jaws, he slowly exhaled through his nostrils, an attempt to relax his tensed muscles. He glanced sideways to see Calder moving forward. Slowly raising his sword, he glanced right. Maddock was still easing forward as well. His stomach twisted in a knot. He didn't see it. Damn it. Just as he lifted his foot to move forward, something cold and unnaturally sharp touched the right side of his neck, sending a chill down his spine. He leapt to the left and half-turned to the right, swinging his blade horizontally at torso level. His black sword whispered through the air. He jerked his head back and forth, searching for the assailant. Raising his weapon to the ready, he realized his neck was burning. He hadn't felt the familiar warm tingle of blood running down his flesh, so he ignored it as a scratch. Though his first thought told him only an elf could move so fast, experience had taught him to never underestimate any of the species that inhabited Virilia. Goosebumps crawled up his arm. He could hear his heartbeat thrumming in his ears now, as he took a deep breath and held it. An eerie feeling someone was standing behind him raised the hairs on his neck. He spun and swung his sword again, this time faster with both hands. Whoosh! Arik sliced through nothing again. His chest grew tight, begging him to take deeper breaths. "Impressive," a voice called from behind him. "For a human." Arik jumped forward. His cheeks reddened as he landed. He realized immediately who had spoken and who had tagged his neck. He could recognize her voice from any other elf. He shoved his sword back into its sheath as he turned. "Elandrea?" "Rare is it to find a human with senses like that," said Elandrea. She was dressed in what Arik had been told was Merinthial armor, unblemished silver with golden swirls. On each of her hips were curved daggers. A sword was fashioned on her back beneath a pale cloak. On each spalder was a crest of a dragon emblem. A grin tugged at the edges of Arik's lips as he looked up and down at Elandrea. 16 years I've been doing this, and you don't look a day over 500. "Flattery will get you nowhere, Sentinel," said Elandrea. Her lips pursed. Whether she was trying to hide a smile, Arik never knew. He only hoped. She looked to the horizon. "Where is your unit?" "I have 3 other—" "Your full unit," Elandrea interrupted. "I have little use for a reconnaissance team on this endeavour." Arik narrowed his eyes and looked toward the horizon. Captain Brynard Francel is back in the trench, a half-hour's walk. He cocked his head. "What do you mean by this endeavour? Is there more than one egg this time?" "Gather your team," said Elandrea. "Stay here." Without waiting for a response, she turned and spirited away, her steps nearly as silent as Arik's were moments ago. Chapter 2. An Urgent Rendezvous. Watching the elf run away at the speed of a warhorse, Arik gave another long whistle. Calder and Maddock echoed the call and rushed back. Lastly, Morrow reached them. "What is it?" "Elandrea decided to grace us with her presence for a moment," Arik said dryly. "You mean grace you?" Maddock said with a chuckle. "Get fucked," Arik teased. "Is that your goal?" Maddock laughed. "She'll put you through a wall." Arik grinned sheepishly. "I'd let her." Morrow turned his golden eyes to the horizon. The sky to the east was glowing orange and red as the sun had begun to show its face. "Where's the convoy?" Arik exhaled deeply and shook his head. "Something's off." "Off?" questioned Maddock. He gripped his long sword tighter and shifted his stance. "Stand down," said Arik. "They're coming. It's just— I don't know yet." After 5 minutes of waiting, Arik began to grow irritated. "Gods damn it! Where are they? We're a firefly glowing on a placid midnight lake here." Then he saw it. The silhouette of something massive and lumpy, like a weathered mountain, was moving toward them. The elven convoy's armor shimmered like stars. Arik narrowed his eyes. That can't be." Morrow squinted, then held his hand over his brows. "What is that?" Arik took a couple of steps forward as the bulk of the convoy slowly came into focus. There were no doubts about what he saw when a gargantuan wing flexed, then folded back down. His heart pounded in his chest. "Is that a dragon?" asked Calder. His eyes widened as his mouth fell agape with a trance. "I've never seen one before." "Aye," said Maddock. He lifted his long sword and shoved it into a wide scabbard before dropping it into its holder on his back. Even with his height, it nearly reached down to his ankles. "You're a kid. Of course you haven't seen one." Morrow slowly smiled. "How long has it been, Arik?" "About 12 years. Arik pulled himself out of his daze and cleared his throat. "Look alive, men. Today is one of high rarity. I don't know why a dragon mage would be risking the scar, but it has to be far more important than a single egg." "Calder," Maddock said as he clapped the young sentinel on the shoulder. "Try not to soak your leggings. Mail tends to rust faster that way." Calder shrugged off Maddock's giant hand. Shut up. Quiet, Auric hissed. He thought about the arrival of a dragon in the misty scar. Why would they come this way? He narrowed his eyes. It's not walking. His heart sank. It's injured. How do you know? Asked Calder. Because it's been ferried on a platform, Morrow said. He leaned closer to Calder and pointed. See the sling drivers? Horses? Maddox snorted. No, the dogs. What dogs? Calder asked, squinting. Maddox looked sideways at Calder and shook his head. You're hopeless, boy. There. Auric pointed at the centre of the crowd moving swiftly toward them, a dust cloud blowing behind their steps. He glanced at Calder. That lead elk, the white one, that's a dragon mage. Calder furrowed his brows. How can you tell? Maddox sighed. You just get used to seeing them with the job, I suppose. Auric nodded. Yeah, they're just more poised than typical elves. Their armour is different. Swords too. One of the riders broke free from the formation and raced toward them. Once they were close enough, Auric recognised the fiery red hair immediately. His stomach fluttered. His face reddened. Varanthia. Easy there, brother, said Morrow. He nudged Auric with his elbow and chuckled. Piss off, Auric growled. He stood straighter and tucked his hands behind the small of his back. Business as usual. Uh-huh, mumbled Morrow, as he stepped in line with Auric and took the same stance. Maddox and Calder stood on each side of them and assumed the attention stance. Riding a black-tailed buck, the elf approached. Before the elk slowed, she leapt from its back. Soaring 20 feet forward, she landed within a sword's reach of Auric. Altogether, the sentinels bowed. Sentinel Auric, said the elf, her voice softer than Elandrea's, yet somehow just as cold. Auric straightened again and peered into her emerald eyes. He swallowed a lump in his throat. Lady Varanthia. Elandrea tells me you are removed from your unit. Her words were a statement, not a question, unemotional and dry. She walked around the quartet, looking them up and down. Is that why the smell persists? Auric smirked once she was behind him, understanding the elf's dry humour. My lady, we were sent out as a reconnaissance team. Has there been trouble along the way to the scar? Varanthia circled back around to the front of Auric. Nothing the elven court couldn't dispatch swiftly. Her eyes smiled, though she stayed relatively poised. Impatience is not a trait we share with humans. If only your commander would have waited mere hours, we would be upon the trench. Auric swallowed a lump in his throat again, and looked past her shoulder. My lady, is that a dragon that approaches? It is. Varanthia's mount strolled up beside her and halted. Mistake not, sentinels. This is no ordinary convoy. Auric nodded. I can see that. What would you have of us? Varanthia looked over her shoulder. Once this task is complete, you will be subjugated to the wards in the Vrelen Guard. Auric furrowed his brows. We're going to be memory wiped. Varanthia stared at Auric for a moment. It is imperative, as you will see. That's fine, Auric said sternly, though he loathed the idea. Memory wiped? Calder blurted. You can't just... Auric glared at the kid. It's fine. He held his cold eyes on Calder until the younger downcast his eyes and fell silent. You have no mounts, said Varanthia. Stay ahead of the convoy on your return to your post. We will follow you to Captain Francel. Then we will move due north to the Vrelen Guard. Auric cocked his head. Will we not be using the scar to shroud our movements this time? She didn't answer his question with words, though a lingering look told him not to ask any more. Alert your commander of what is impending his squadron, and only him. Are my instructions clear, Sentinel? Auric gave a slow nod. As clear as Lake Town, milady. Without hesitation, he turned and marched back toward the trenches, his small unit closely following. "What about stealth?" asked Calder. "Ahead is our post," said Auric. "Behind is a dragon mage, and what looks like a special convoy of the Elven court. If anything attacks, it won't go for us. That wagon carrying the dragon will be upon us before we reach Francel." Calder looked back over his shoulder, then glanced up. "What about the Valravs?" Auric rolled his eyes. "They hunt over the scar by sound first." Calder scoffed. "Yeah, and they'll hear—"
"That giant-ass platform and the squad of elk hooves,"
Maddock interrupted with a growling annoyance.
"Just keep moving, kid."
Auric glanced at Maddock's bulging gut and smirked. "Sorry, big guy." Maddock cocked his head.
"For what?"
Auric broke into a jog. "We need to move faster."
"Bloody bastard."
Maddock's voice fell behind the other three. After nearly 10 minutes of jogging, Auric looked back over his shoulder. Maddock had one advantage to keep up, and that was his stride, which nearly doubled the length of an average sentinel. He couldn't help but chuckle at Maddock's awkward, clunky steps. "Keeping up." Maddock's breaths were heavy, his face red and glistening with sweat. He waved a hand.
"Keep going. Can't keep me down that easy."
Morrow laughed. "Never doubted you." Auric's chest was growing tight beneath the mail armour. The worst part of being stuck in a trench for weeks at a time was the lack of exercise, and he was feeling it now. His legs burned. But a quick look over his shoulder only served to amplify his fortitude. "They're still gaining on us." "They're on bloody fucking mounts, Auric," Calder huffed. "Welcome to the role of a sentinel, kid," said Morrow. Without warning, a black and purple bolt of shadowy energy soared past Auric, out into the even mist. It crashed behind them, slinging chunks of dirt into the air. He quickly slid to a halt and drew his sword. He looked at the others with widened eyes. "Sangrabor!" Morrow withdrew 2 daggers just as Maddock reached them, and turned around, drawing his longsword. "A Sangrabor? Here!" Auric whirled around. "Backs together! Move!" Calder's face went white. In the distance of the mist, a blood-curdling scream came from an elk. "The convoy, Auric," Morrow growled. "We have to—" "I know," Auric hissed. He looked back and forth. The convoy began to erupt in vibrant flashes of green and purple light. "What do we do?" cried Calder. Auric glanced sideways at the kid, then did a double take as he realized Calder's sword still clung to his hip. "Draw your fucking sword!" He rolled his eyes. "Better yet. Calder, you and Maddock run back to the trench. Tell Francel we're under attack. Bring everyone!" "I'll go," said Morrow quickly. "I'm faster than Maddock. No offense." Auric's stomach churned at the thought of separating from Morrow. He shook his head. "No, I need your speed here." "Auric, just go," Morrow said sternly. "Francel is further. We'll be back in no time." God damn it. Auric knew Morrow was right, but they had never split up in a battle before. Not once. He turned and hugged Morrow, squeezing tightly. "Go. Watch his back." He glanced at Calder. "Remember your training, kid. I know you haven't faced orcs yet, but you're about to. Swing your sword true. Don't hesitate." Calder nodded, his arms trembling. Morrow nodded, and without a word they sprinted away. Auric looked at Maddock. "You ready?"
"To fight sorcerers?"
Maddock asked as he gripped both hands on the handle of his longsword.
"Not really."
Auric huffed. "Me neither. But there's never any other reason to run toward a Sangrabor."
"Aye,"
said Maddock.
"And no one else I'd rather fight beside. If war is upon us—"
Auric jogged back toward the convoy, finishing the Sentinel's motto. "Then war becomes us." Chapter 3. The Choice. By the time Auric and Maddox came into a clear view of the convoy, a battle was being engaged on two fronts. 4 elves and the Dragon Mage, whom Auric had never seen before, were fighting the Sangrabors with magic. The Dragon Mage was easier to spot than the rest of the elves, in his scarlet armour and shimmering blood-red sword. His spells were faster and brighter than the others as well. At a quick glance, as he ran towards a massive Hargrel, the largest of the orc types, Auric guessed there were 4 dozen elves. He barreled past the Dragon Mage, dodged a bolt of purple energy, and drove his black sword into the lower back of the olive-toned orc. He quickly pulled it out and stepped back as the orc released a deep and raspy scream. Auric's heart raced with a familiarity only a fight could bring. He ducked just in time to evade a massive rusty axe from the orc. He had seen these weapons 7 men in 2. Before he stirred, he shoved the tip of his right sword into the orc's foot, producing another monstrous scream. Standing, he drew his second blade from his back and slashed the back of the orc's shoulder. Maddox caught up and buried his longsword into the orc's leather-covered thigh. The blade made a muted thud as it struck bone. The 8-foot-tall orc dropped awkwardly to one knee and slammed Maddox in the chest with the butt end of his axe, sending him flying backward 10 feet. Auric seized the opportunity while the orc was turned to carve a diagonal line across the right side of the orc's neck. Black blood sprayed into the air. The orc swung his axe low, lethargically and single-handedly as he pressed his palm against the wound in his neck. Jumping over the tribal weapon, Auric barely escaped the attack. As he landed, he swung both swords together in a downward angle. One blade sliced through both of the orc's cheeks, clanging against teeth. The other sliced through the orc's first 3 fingers, and landed an inch above his first cut in the orc's neck. It stuck in his dark flesh. The orc turned his face skyward and roared a raspy and gurgling cry of agony. His mouth split open from the gash in his cheeks, held together now by only the white ligaments of his jaws. Auric ripped his sword from the orc's neck and stepped back.
I got him,
Maddox yelled as he picked up his longsword and ran toward the orc. With a wide rotation and a bellow suited for their enemy, he removed the orc's massive head. It landed with a dull thud in the dirt, bouncing awkwardly as the skull and jaw moved separately. Without warning, something shimmered past Auric's head with a metallic hum. Turning, he realized it was an elven shortsword that was now buried in another orc's eye. In a flash, fiery red hair whipped past him. Varanthia, what's... She was already 40 feet away. Leaping into the air, she landed on her target's shoulder and locked her legs around its chest and back. She withdrew a second shortsword from the armour on her back. Using both silver blades together like shears, she opened up both sides of the orc's throat, spewing a rain of black into the air. As the orc fell, she leaped into a backflip, twisted gracefully, and continued running forward.
We'll just do that next time,
Maddox said with a sardonic laugh. Auric looked back at the sound of deep roars. To the south, a massive shadow crawled across the land. His heart pounded in his chest, though now from fear. They've never marched with these numbers before.
Gotta be the dragon, yeah?
Maddox asked. Looking back at the red dragon lying on the wagon, Auric realized what attempt was going to happen. Spinning around, he found the Dragon Mage engaged with 2 Sangrabors, matching them both spell for spell. Green fire roared to life from the elf, blocking a beam of violet from an orc. That's why.
Here to take the dragon,
Maddox said, obviously coming to the same conclusion as Auric. The Dragon Mage furrowed his brows but kept his gaze on the Furian magic erupting from the orc. Obviously, Sentinel. Where is your unit? They should be on their way, Auric bellowed over the cacophony of steel against steel.
Auric!
Maddox yelled as he shoved Auric to the ground. Something black caught Auric's periphery. Whirling around and lifting his sword to block what he assumed was an axe or sword, he watched a long arrow punch through Maddox's chest from somewhere up high. It passed through the big man's chest, punched out of his back and pinned his body to the ground. The long bolt held him halfway upright in an unnatural diagonal angle, as if he had fallen backward and time had frozen. "Maddock!" Auric cried as he ran to him. The air was filled with a blood-curdling set of calls. Looking up with a new sense of rage, he noticed 2 dark patches in the sky. Cupping his hand around his mouth, he yelled to any elf who could hear, "Valravs!" "Auric," Maddock groaned. Blood oozed from the corner of his mouth. He breathed in, wheezing, and held his hand out toward his longsword. No, leave it," Auric said. He shoved his left sword into its sheath and took Maddock's hand in his own. "Hold on. I'm going to cut it down." Stepping back, he looked at the 5-foot-long arrow. It had more girth than his thumb. Maddock let out a long exhale. Shit. He knew a chest wound from a Valrav's arrow was certainly fatal for a human. He looked into Maddock's dull eyes, his stomach threatening to heave up his breakfast from earlier. Slowly, he lowered his sword and looked down. Maddock was dead. Auric's chest pounded with heavy thrums in his heart. "I'm sorry, brother. May the gods carry you into Vrelson." He gripped his blade tight and looked up. The Valravs circled overhead, releasing arrow after arrow at the dragon, each deflected by elven spells. Looking at the beautiful creature on the wagon, he studied it for a moment. He saw no wounds. No joint was dislodged, nor were the wings torn. "It's not injured," he concluded. One of the sangribors screamed behind him as its legs buckled backward unnaturally. Another orc was lifted into the air by black vines from the dragon mage, then thrown toward Auric. Before she stopped rolling, Auric drove his sword into her mouth, cracking the base of her skull as a mass crashed into him. A second sangribor lifted his trembling hand toward Auric. Then a thin beam of red fire severed it before the orc could cast another spell. "Move, sentinel," called the dragon mage. Auric shook his head, as if he were a wet dog to call back on his focus. "Dragon mage, Valravs!" He pointed upward with his sword. "Bu estala," the elf yelled over the battle. He held his palms skyward. "Val Ravner mot Melekter." Auric nodded and looked back to see 6 elves climb into the backs of the slingers, the massive black horses mostly used to move catapults. As they released golden arrows into the sky, Auric heard the dragon mage behind him. "Kraf Metterfil, Fliss!" The 6 arrows glowed bright orange, then exploded into dozens of shards just before reaching the Valravs. Taller than sangribors but thinner than hargrals, Valravs were supernaturally agile and light. This allowed them to ride the Valravan, dire wolves with the heads and talons of ravens. Auric shook his head. "That won't work!" He had known for years the orcs' beasts outmatched everything in the air but dragons. With Valravs in their saddles, they proved to be the highest threat to dragon mages in flight. They dodged the splinters of arrows with ease. 2 of the Valravs released arrows into the archers below, with one managing to pierce through the back of a slinger horse. "Make them explode!" Auric yelled. "Silence, sentinel!" yelled the dragon mage. His face twisted as he slowly curled his fingers into a fist. Auric turned back and watched the splinters change direction behind the Valravs. Circling back toward the dragon mage, they ripped through the riders. With high-pitched squalls from their mounts, the orc archers plummeted to their death. He looked back at the dragon mage. "Well done." "Tend to the Hargrals, sentinel," the dragon mage said coldly. "That is your duty." Auric clenched his jaws and drew his second sword back out. With a frustrated roar, he ran toward the oncoming orcish army. Chapter 4. General Tharlock. After 10 minutes of sprinting, Morrow came to a halt as he heard something ahead in the mist. Grabbing the back of Calder's mail tunic, he whispered, Wait. Calder looked back with widening eyes, breathing heavily. What is it? From the back of his belt, Morrow withdrew 2 longer daggers. Squinting, he looked back and forth at the horizon ahead. Listen. Calder's face flushed. He drew his broadsword. What? Shut up, Morrow hissed. In the distance, beyond sight, low grumbling echoed. Then a deep growl followed. A thump. Then came a mix of chainmail being torn apart and a guttural scream. It was quickly muted by another metallic thud and a gurgling sound. Morrow's heart pounded in his chest. Looking back over his shoulder, he cursed under his breath. They were too far away from the elven court now to turn back. Calder stepped backward slowly, holding his sword with both hands. His eyes were wide. Was that... Don't say it, Morrow interrupted. His chest grew tight. He knew what the sound was, with every fibre of his being. 16 years as a sentinel had taught him many things, and forced even more to become habitual, instinctual. Should we turn back? Calder asked with a tremble. Morrow swallowed and shook his head. He pointed a dagger forward. The trench should be just ahead, he whispered. If we... A deep thump hit the ground in the mist. Then another, and another as it grew louder. Morrow's stomach twisted. Few creatures held the mass to shake the ground as they walked. In the evermist, a dark shadow came into focus. With each step, it swayed back and forth. Aim for the eyes, he whispered softly to Calder. Looking at Morrow, Calder arched his brow. What is that? His sword trembled in his hands. A Harrow bear, Morrow said as he slowly crouched in a stance of which he could move swiftly if need be. He twisted his feet back and forth, digging into the soft surface of the soil. A warbear. The evermist swirled as the bear sniffed, then exhaled deeply. It halted and groaned, as if communicating. Morrow looked around. Fuck. What? Calder asked. Morrow squinted. All around them was bleak and unchanged in the pale fog. There's a rider. Without warning, a pulsating whoosh came from the right, just before a massive axe came into view through the mist. Down! Morrow yelled. He dove for Calder. Too late. The blade of the axe was the length of a human's torso. It ripped through Calder's shoulder, severing his arm completely. The kid screamed as the force of the axe sent him flipping sideways through the air. He slammed into the ground and rolled several times. Dirt was packed around the bone jutting out of his shoulder. Morrow looked back from where the axe came from as heavy footfalls preceded a hargrel sprinting toward them. He glanced at the bear standing still. With a quick twist, threw both daggers. The first stuck in the orc's chest. The second hit him in the forehead with the handle. Without hesitating, he drew 2 smaller throwing blades from his vest. Both of them stabbed into the orc with the second round of throws. By the time he drew 2 more, the hargrel was upon him.
Where they be?
The orc roared, and dove head first, both of his thick hands outstretched. Morrow slid forward and ducked beneath the 8-foot-tall hargrel. He lifted his knives, slicing into dull green flesh as the orc passed overhead. Quickly getting to his feet, he looked to see where the bear was. Morrow! Screamed Calder. Whirling around, Morrow's stomach churned in a knot. The bear had bit down on Calder's leg and was shaking him violently. It growled and thrashed its huge claws into Calder's back and hips, until the kid's leg was ripped off at the knee. Calder screamed louder. His voice turned shrill as the bear dropped the leg and raked its claws across his side, exposing his ribcage. The mail and leather armour did nothing against the 1,800-pound bear. A second swipe revealed Calder's spine. The orc stood up straight and laughed.
Bad madraka.
Morrow took a careful aim. I'm sorry, kid. He threw a dagger, landing it with a dull thud in Calder's temple, silencing the screams. This didn't stop the bear from ripping off the other arm and tearing into his flesh as easily as if it were a pool of water. Slowly taking out another knife, Morrow looked at the orc, who now had his axe in hand again. Come on. The bear reared its head toward Morrow and sprinted toward him.
Drenok!
The orc yelled, glaring at the bear. It halted in its tracks and turned its gaze to the ground. Licking blood from its snout, let out a whine. Morrow watched with shock as the orc put his axe in a holder on his back. For the first time in his life, he got to take in the full view of a living Hargrel up close. Garbed in leather leggings, the orc had not a shred of fat on him. His arms were the girth of a man's thigh. A leather strap crossed his chest, holding the axe in place on his back. He was bald, with a thick black beard braided down to his chest, decorated with small bones and beads. More curved bones were pierced through his nose and ears. 4 large canine teeth gave him the appearance of a slight underbite. Around his neck was a bone collar, the centerpiece a human jawbone.
You have fear not for me,
said the orc. It was a statement, an observation more than a question. Morrow's chest heaved and begged for deeper breaths. He gripped his daggers tighter and shook his head. His shoulder-length dreads were drenched from the evermist and sweat. I'm not afraid of you, no, and I'm not afraid to die.
I, General Tharlock,
said the orc, his voice a raspy baritone. And I don't give a shit, Morrow growled. Tharlock pointed toward the trenches.
You men not fear for me, for but too, or death.
Morrow's heart sank as he imagined the orc and warbear tearing through his unit. Are they all dead? Tharlock took a deep breath and nodded.
Ah.
Morrow flicked his left dagger around for a reverse grip. Then let's finish this. Tharlock looked back at Calder's mangled body.
You strong man. I think keep you I will.
Morrow narrowed his eyes. Think I'll pass. Where did you learn our language? Tharlock cackled and pointed at Morrow. He began pacing in a wide circle. Glancing at the bear, but he snapped his fingers and gave a clicking noise with his tongue. The bear groaned and lay down.
We learned new language many moons past.
Yeah? Morrow asked, furrowing his brows. Well, you fucking suck at it. Are we going to fight or have a shitty conversation?
You kill not General Tharlock.
The orc pointed at the bear.
Oh, but why you want death for?
Captain Francel, Morrow said sternly. Is he alive?
You half-breed commander,
Tharlock asked with a grin.
Ask her question. Want her show you?
Morrow felt a wave of nausea sending an ache to his jaws. There's no way out of this, he decided. Without giving away any signs, he threw his right dagger, then his left. Tharlock held up a hand and swatted the first blade away like a fly. He looked down at the dagger still in his chest.
Ah.
Using 2 fingers, he pulled it out as if it were but a nuisance splinter. With a single swipe of his hand, he removed the other dagger from his stomach.
You come with Tharlock.
Never. Morrow bared his teeth and crouched, drawing another dagger from his boot. His last. Tharlock walked forward, holding his arms outstretched.
You fight what for? Elves.
I fight for what's right, Morrow said. He pointed his blade at the orc. Not for monsters like you who kill for the thrill.
You know lies, said Tharlok.
He halted 2 steps away from Morrow.
Ergoth show you the way.
Morrow's heart sank. The mention of the name sent a shiver down his spine, raising the hair on his neck. Asgrim's war chief had a reputation for being one of the most dangerous orcs to ever have lived. He swallowed a lump in his throat and stood up straight. Ergoth.
War chief bring truth to eyes,
said Tharlok. Morrow shook his head and looked at Ba'at. The bear was staring at him intently, ready to pounce. If you're going to kill me, just get it over with. Tharlok burst into a deep laugh.
I say I keep you, no kill. Come.
He turned and walked away, as a parent would expect their child to follow. Morrow's heart crashed against his chest as it grew tighter. He could sense his death coming closer by the second. No. Tharlok slowly turned and glared at Morrow.
I not asking.
With a gesture of his hand, Ba'at perked up and bared her teeth. A low growl hummed in her throat. Morrow took a deep breath. He let his body relax as he stood up straighter and held his arms out wide. He dropped the dagger to the ground. Then kill me. Without a word, Tharlok rushed forward and raised his axe high. Morrow squeezed his eyes shut as he prepared for death's embrace. A searing pain stabbed into the side of his head. A quick view of the giant over him flashed by as he opened his eyes. His vision blurred, then faded to black as he landed hard in the dirt. Chapter 5. Scars at the Scar. Auric's face was covered in thick, black blood. A deep gash burned in his left shoulder, making his offhand rather useless. His ankle throbbed from tripping over a dead elf moments ago. 4 elves stood before him, weaving green magic into the horde of orcs. Breathing heavily, he watched as the dragon mage laid his hand on the scarlet dragon and closed his eyes. What's wrong with him? Her, corrected the dragon mage. She is moments from releasing her egg. Auric's heart jolted. She's pregnant. One of the orcs broke rank and circled around the elves. We need to... Silence, sentinel, yelled the dragon mage. I must focus. Auric clenched his jaws. He rapidly grew tired of the elves' commands in battle. Fuck it, he thought. With a roar he ran, half limping toward the orcs flanking. As one swung an axe vertically, Auric turned and dodged. He brought his sword down on the orc's fingers. Like sausage links, they fell to the ground. The orc roared and stepped back, dropping the axe, and blood squirted from 4 stubs. Shaking his hand, he lunged forward and grabbed Auric by the neck with his other hand. The orc lifted him off the ground with visible ease. With an underhand stab, Auric's blade stuck into the orc's eye. The monstrous warrior released him and cupped a hand over his face, roaring like a lion. Without hesitation, Auric stepped diagonally to the outside and sliced across the orc's knee with his sword, dropping him into a kneel. Don't let him grab you again, he told himself. You're faster. He knows it. Twisting back to the right, he swung his blade horizontally into the side of the orc's head, splitting his ear in half and knocking him sideways. With another full twist, Auric stepped toward him and shoved his sword into the soft underside of the orc's chin. The orc grabbed the hilt of Auric's sword before it could be buried into his brain. Auric's eyes widened. With a useless left arm, he thought quickly and let go of his sword. He stepped back. The orc blindingly swung his hand outward, blood running down his cheek and neck. He growled as he slowly began pulling the blade out of his chin. Auric leaned back, dodged the thick fingers, and saw his opening. As the orc leaned away, Arik kicked the bottom of his sword handle, driving the black blade halfway into the orc's head. With a single grunt, the orc dropped onto his chest, his face indenting the ground. Looking to his right, Arik watched Elandrea leap onto the orc's back, perform 3 quick cuts, and dismount the orc all within a second. The orc clutched her neck and chest as she fell onto her knees, then her chest. A final gurgling exhale escaped her as she died. Arik sagged his shoulders. Really? Just... He pulled his sword out of his dead orc. Like that? Sons of bitches, he muttered as he shook his head. Why am I even here? As if he'd asked the question out loud, the dragon mage called, You, sentinel, assist with the clutches. Arik nodded and shoved his sword into its sheath as he quickly glanced over his shoulder. While he had seen dragons, even up close, it had been a long time. Their beauty was truly unmatched in Meyranor. Turning to face her, his heart raced. He approached cautiously and unfastened one of the clutches that were keeping the dragon from falling off of the wagon. He reached for a second clasp as the dragon roared. As she jerked, her stomach convulsed. He paused and held his hands up, watching to see if she would thrash again. When she didn't, he quickly unlatched the iron clasp. The dragon mage and 3 other elves quickly moved around the wagon and released her. Arik quickly stepped backward as she rose to her feet, threatening to tip the wagon on its edge. She unfurled her wings, a stretch she no doubt needed after being confined. Once she stepped off of the wagon, Arik's eyes widened as he slowly backpedaled, taking in the full scope of her size. At full height, she wouldn't fit in most of the smaller outlier villages. Perhaps the castle in Greyhorn was the only human structure with the capability to house her, and she was taller than any 2-story house. He guessed over 25 feet tall and 40 feet long. "Move, sentinel!" yelled the dragon mage. Arik snapped to attention and moved sideways as he realized the dragon had opened her mouth. She hissed like a great serpent. A glow quickly rolled up the softer front of her long neck, before an immense flame erupted outward in a beam nature could envy. Without warning, someone grabbed Arik's jerkin and pulled him into the air. As he was thrown to his back on the wagon, he realized the dragon mage and nearly all of the elves had positioned themselves behind the dragon, as she spit a long jet of flames into the oncoming orc army. How the hell did I not see them move? He shook his head. Get your shit together, he told himself. For a moment he lay still and watched the flames devour the orcs. Even still they advanced. For every orc that stopped and burned, another stepped forward. Some of the larger Hargrals used their comrades' corpses as shields. That forced Arik to his feet. A nauseating anxiety sent his stomach into his chest, labouring his breaths. How long can she hold it? Not much longer, said the dragon mage. He reached his hand out and closed his eyes as he began muttering something that sounded to Arik like Valerian, the elf tongue. Arik's heart pounded in his chest as he noticed the orcs advancing faster than they were dying. On either side of her jet of flames, they began flanking. My God, he whispered. From the top of the wagon, he could see the sea of orcs double timing from the horizon. How many are there? He drew his sword. Varanthia stepped toward the edge of the wagon as her sword arm slowly fell. Too many. Her tone was drenched with defeat. Elandrea called loudly from behind Arik. Though she spoke in Valerian, he understood one word clearly. Anumak. It was one of the few elven words he had learned over the years. Arik furrowed his brows and whirled around. Egg. What egg? Elandrea kept her gaze on the onslaught. Arik turned back around and looked at the dragon, then at the slinger horses. She's pregnant, he whispered to himself. He spun around again and faced Elandrea.
Is she about to lay the egg now?
Again, Elandrea ignored his words.
His eyes darted back and forth, looking at the elves, then the dragon mage, as he realised he was right. His stomach churned.
How asinine was it for you to bring her through here? Elandrea's eyes darted toward Auric. Stand down, sentinel.
Auric scoffed. Fucking idiots. And I thought elves were supposed to be wise. He shook his head. Why not? Oh, I don't know. Take to the sea. He rolled his eyes and turned back. The flames began to diminish. The dragon's legs trembled. The dragon mage opened his eyes and sank to his knees. Nelai poliani nekalen. Off the wagon, sentinel. Now! Roared Elandrea. Auric leaped forward as the dragon closed her mouth and turned. With 2 staggered steps, she fell into her side with a thunderous boom. The wagon rocked violently under her heft. Under his own weight, Auric's legs buckled. He rolled forward and returned to his feet, looking back at the fallen protector. Sentinel, the dragon mage groaned. Auric's heart jolted as he turned to see the dragon mage lying on his back. He knelt down. Sir? Stay with the caravan. The dragon mage's voice was hoarse and weak. Auric furrowed his brows. I don't... Nunim Nakansi! Elandrea roared as she sped past Auric and the dragon mage, her sword held high. In a flash, most of the remaining elves followed her and charged into the battle. The dragon mage sat up with a grunt. We're moving. As he slowly got to his feet, so too did Auric. Just as they reached their full height, the dragon mage's legs gave out from beneath him. Auric caught him around the waist. Despite their height, which was generally taller than any man's, they were lighter than most expected them to be. Easy, sir. Let me help. Get me to Nakalain, said the dragon mage, lifting a shaking hand and pointing at the dragon. As Auric hoisted the dragon mage back to his feet, he realized his sword was gone. Shit. The dragon lifted her head and roared as her stomach convulsed again. Valore! Yelled Elandrea. Auric looked over his shoulder, just in time to see a thin black blur fly past him. Following it with his eyes, he watched a man-sized arrow stab into the roof of Nakalayan's mouth. She screamed so loud that Auric felt as if his ears were about to explode. He dropped the dragon mage and covered his ears. Tears instantly filled his eyes. Nakalayan! Yelled the dragon mage. He had landed on his knees and screamed as he clutched his chest. The great dragon fell silent as her head rolled back and landed on the ground on the other side of the wagon. Aye, Nakalayan! Cried the dragon mage. Valore, as Auric had only just learned his name. Auric's chest heaved as he tried to catch his breath. As he wiped his eyes, he spotted something shimmering, rolling toward the edge of the wagon. His stomach twisted as he realized the black and gold object was an egg. Without a second thought, he ran toward it. Leaping with his arms outstretched, he landed on his chest and grunted as the air in his lungs threatened to depart. The egg fell. Before it could land, an elf dipped his foot out, caught it, then tossed it up to his hand in a single motion. Stay with Valore. He turned and jumped onto the wagon, then bounded over the fallen dragon. Auric furrowed his brows. Did he not want me to take the egg? He rolled his eyes and pressed himself up to his knees. A hargrowl broke through the line of the remainder of the elves and barreled towards Valore. In a panic, Auric looked around on the ground for his sword. It lay just beyond Valore. As he scooped it up, he heard a vicious roar. 2 orcs charged through an elf with their axes. One removed half of her arm, and the other severed her torso in 2. They barreled toward Auric. Valore grabbed Auric's forearm. Immediately, Auric felt his strength wither. He dropped to his knees as his mind filled with an invisible fog.
What are you doing?
Flore rolled to his side and faced the orcs. Atlas at lopla nikla. Swirling orange energy exploded from his palm. 2 thin lines of glowing fire stabbed into the orcs. Auric gasped as Flore released him. Looking up, he watched both orcs halt and roar as they dropped their axes. Clutching their chest, they fell to their knees. With horror, Auric witnessed the flesh of both monsters begin to boil as they clawed at themselves. Then, without warning, bright orange embers burst from their chests. Black blood sprayed into the air as they collapsed onto their backs. Auric slowly looked at Flore. He sighed and closed his eyes. "Sir, we have to move. Now!" Flore sluggishly lifted his hand. "No, Sentinel. You go. Take the egg." Auric looked up at the elf standing on the wagon with the black egg tucked against his chest. "Someone has it, sir. It'll be—" "No," said Flore, waving his hand. He coughed and slowly opened one eye. "Negni silvakot mavoska emis leni, karansala epsis amale." Auric furrowed his brows. I don't understand Valerian, sir." Varanthia landed beside Auric and held her hand out. "Never grow a wishbone where there should be a spine." Auric shook his head and started to rise to his feet. "No, help him. He's more important." "He has made his choice, Sentinel," said Varanthia. "Nakalean won't survive, and Flore won't have the strength to move for days. He will use his life to spare others." Auric's stomach churned as he looked at Flore. "No, He paused and stood up straight. "I can help you, sir. Let me—" "She's precise," said Flore, still refusing to open his eyes. Auric swallowed a lump growing in his throat. "So you would lie there and face death rather than avenge your dragon?" "You know not the ways of the bond between elf and dragon, Sentinel," Varanthia said sternly. "He will lose part of his soul with the passing of Nakalean and his magic. His time is draining rapidly. We must go." Auric's heart pounded in his chest. He glanced over his shoulder and realized the orcs were slowly gaining ground again. Elves were falling left and right. "Then do something. Help her. Help the dragon!" Varanthia took a deep breath. "I am no mage, Sentinel. Unless you have some whimsical traits that you have been concealing, helping her is a task neither of us has in our capability." "So we're running, is that it?" Auric asked rhetorically. He glanced to the west. "The other sentinels will be dead," said Flore. "I can feel the forces of life around us." His breaths came slow and heavy. "There are no humans besides you, left for at least 5 leagues. Auric's heart sank as he thought of Morrow. "No, your power is fading, right? Perhaps you're—" "It takes him no effort to feel the forces of life so close," said Varanthia. "My lady," said the elf on the wagon. He glanced down at the egg.
"Lady Elandrea has fallen. The charge lies with you now."
Auric narrowed his eyes as they misted over. His breath caught in his chest. No, he had to have survived. "Sentinel," said Varanthia. "You heard Belore Garrost. I am all that stands now between them and the egg." Auric looked at Garrost, standing on the wagon. Why did he speak in my tongue? "So you would understand," said Flore. "All is not lost if you succeed with the task." A swell of rage grew in Auric's chest as he thought about the sentinels he had left to die in the trench, as he thought about Morrow, his lifelong friend and brother. He tightened his grip on his sword and glared at the orcs. "Abandon your vengeance," said Varanthia.
You shall find victory only in the quest of your own death. Weigh your chances. They are null.
Get me to her, said Flore. We will supply you with a lead. He opened his eyes and narrowed them at Auric. Waste not this sacrifice. Varanthia bent down and picked up Flore, as a mother would lift her toddler. With swiftness and seemingly ease, she leaped onto the wagon and laid Flore down. Auric's breaths became quick, as he saw the last dozen elves fighting in a half-circle, a barrier of flesh and steel between the orcs and the dragon mage.
Fuck!
He roared, then shoved his blade back into the sheath on his back. He turned and ran to the wagon, climbed onto it and looked down at Flore. What will you do? Something unseen. This century, Flore said with a rasp in his throat. Tears streamed down his face as he lay his hand on Nakalayan.
We have to move,
said Varanthia. She looked at Garrost. Go. We will be behind you. Should you find yourself isolated, guide yourself towards Alonore first. Garrost touched his clenched fist to his chest and bowed his head. Netrav atis ma hikolm. Without waiting for a response from Varanthia, he leapt off of the wagon to the north and sprinted away. Now what? Asked Auric. Varanthia swallowed and glanced at the orcs. Now, she glanced at Auric, you try to keep up. Chapter 6. Strangers and Shadows. Auric's legs burned as he forced his will into them, to continue giving chase to Varanthia and Garrost. Without warning, the ground heaved, quaking as a thunderous boom erupted behind him. Halting, he glanced over his shoulder, as if the sky had cracked open to the will of someone with power unnatural to this world. A thick red pillar of fire stuck down and exploded the ground. Then came another strike, followed by a fury of cracks. He looked toward the clouds to see where the fire was raining from. There was no other answer beyond magic. Auric squinted as he watched the bright jet assault the horizon. Pieces of orc bodies flew into the air with chunks of ground. His stomach churned as he witnessed another bolt burn through the side of Nakalayan and explode the wagon. His heart pounded in his chest as a hand wrapped around his arm. "We must go, Sentinel," Varanthia yelled. "That is the final wish of Flore and Nakalayan." Auric began walking backward, keeping his eyes on the cascading mountain of debris, armor, and soil. An orc climbed on top of the wreckage and held his axe high as he roared. He didn't kill them all. No dragon mage could end them all, she said softly. Now, her voice returned with vigor and command. We must go, so as not to waste the sacrifice at hand. Auric sighed and turned to follow Varanthia, though this time she moved at a human's pace. Garrost was out of sight, beyond the thin mist. How far until we reach the Vrelangard? In the least, a straight path. It is 30 leagues. Auric scoffed. His lungs begged for reprieve. I know you want me to go with you, even if just as a meat shield, but I can't run that far. I don't know how much more I can... You are a sentinel, Auric Telendris, Varanthia interrupted with a look over her shoulder. You vowed to do what must be done. Look, Auric said sternly. I'm human. We can't do what you elves can. Speaking that which we both know is moot. Auric stopped running and watched Varanthia slowly come to a halt. Just go, my lady. I'm never going to keep up with you. He has the egg. You can take it to... Do you not know how far east we are, Sentinel? Auric furrowed his brows and glanced to the east. I don't. What does this have to do with... We need you more than a shield. Varanthia flexed her jaw muscles and shifted her feet, as if uncomfortable with a point she was trying to make. Arik narrowed his eyes and glanced over his shoulder as he tried to calculate how far he had run from the trenches. Directly north is Dire Hollow. Precisely, said Varanthia. Now you know. So we must move. Garrost came back through the mist. Why have you stopped, my lady? Some things need elaboration, Varanthia said, keeping her eyes on Arik. Dire Hollow is... How far is that? Arik asked. With you trailing? Asked Garrost. He snorted. Varanthia sighed.
We could arrive by sunrise if we are consistent in our steps.
Consistent in our steps? Arik shook his head. You mean not stopping? Yes. Fine, Arik blurted and threw his hands up. We'll go. But humans need rest. We aren't... He halted as the elves turned around and continued without a word. He shook his head again and huffed. God damn it. By the time the sun began to fade beyond the horizon, Arik was no longer running, or even walking at a normal pace. His moist feet burned, a feeling he had come to know as blisters over the years. His legs ached to the bones. His throat and tongue were dry, a result of mouth breathing. The sweat had stopped pouring from his flesh. The Evermist was an hour at their backs. Broken and dead trees were their company now. Arik staggered to a stop and dropped to his knees. I can't go any more. His eyelids were heavy. His stomach gurgled with starvation. Varanthia and Garrost turned around and walked back to him. We are just over halfway, said Garrost. Arik looked up to see the elves. They were unblemished by fatigue, as beautiful as ever. Garrost shifted the egg from one arm to the other. I need to rest. I need water. Of course, said Varanthia. She looked at Garrost. I often forget the needs of humans to sustain their bodies. Garrost sighed and rolled his eyes. Hard to remember at times, my lady. We require much less. You know God's damn good and well what humans need to survive, Arik thought. Gather him some water, Varanthia commanded. Garrost gave a nod and handed the egg to her. Holding his hands up, he closed his eyes. The scar may be dismal, but it holds a key for human life. His brows crimped low. What's he doing? Arik asked. Veje de mute full, said Garrost. Arik's heart jolted as a cool sensation ran through his knees. He looked down to see the ground darkening rapidly. A sheen appeared on the surface of the soil, as orange as the horizon sky. You can do magic, he muttered. After half a minute, water droplets began flowing into the air and moving toward each other. 10 seconds later, a shining orb of water, more than enough to fill a canteen, appeared frozen in time. Garrost opened his eyes. Drink, Sentinel. Arik's eyes widened with excitement, and he shoved his face into the globe of water. Taking in gulp after gulp, he felt the cold liquid travel through his body and into his empty stomach. He pulled his head back to take a breath, then returned to gorging. Once his stomach began aching, he stopped. Good. Garrost let his hands fall. The remainder of the water splashed Arik's chest, forcing him to take a deep breath as chills ran down his spine. Garrost smirked. Now we can move. Arik wanted to protest, to tell the elf water doesn't reinvigorate the body instantaneously, but he thought about the journey that remained. The thought of staying at an inn in Dire Hollow gave him hope. He nodded and pressed himself up to his feet. Let's go then. Varanthia grinned at Arik, then handed the egg back to Garrost. You don't require food as much as water, do you? Arik quirked a brow. Why? Can he conjure me a deer? Whether or not the elves understood his humour, Auric didn't know, nor did he care. He looked forward to nightfall. Regardless of the elves' wishes, he couldn't see in the dark like they could. That means we will have to stop and rest. But once evenfall set in, Auric realised how famished he was. The sun had gone, and with it its warmth. Knowing they would only risk exposure with a flame, he lay with his back against a dead tree. Just a few hours, he muttered, his eyelids already falling slack. Then we'll rotate. Stay your humility, Sentinel, said Varanthia. We do not require rest just yet. Gather your strength. We will keep watch. He closed his eyes and smirked. You can call me Auric, by the way. Despite the rush of battle flooding into his mind, he found sleep as if it were a candle in the dark. Hours later, he yawned as he slowly opened his eyes. Furrowing his brows, he squinted toward the sky. The sun had not yet crawled over the horizon. A faint smell of smoke lingered from the flameless fire pit. Propping himself up, he habitually grabbed his sword lying on the ground. Varanthia, he whispered. There was no answer. His heart immediately began racing. The air was quiet. His focus dialed in, and his vision cleared. Garost, he whispered harshly. In a single movement, he stood and lifted his sword into a ready stance, left foot forward, blade running parallel with his line of sight. Where the fuck are they? He thought, though his mind immediately settled on the idea that they had left him throughout the night. Guess I wouldn't blame them, he mumbled to himself. Closing his eyes, he began to breathe slowly to calm his heart. He pressed his back against the tree. Think, 8 leagues or so from Direhallow. He opened his eyes and shook his head as he lowered his sword. They wouldn't go to Direhallow without a human escort. He looked to the west and furrowed his brows. Alanora is 100 leagues northwest of Direhallow. He cast his eyes to the ground. Can elves survive a week without food? No, but they're elves. They can hunt and gather. Probably wouldn't take them a week to reach it either. This thought only served to amplify his feeling of isolation between the misty scar and Direhallow. Shit. A light thud landed on the ground on the other side of the tree behind Auric, sending a shiver down his spine. He froze. Holding his breath, he glanced out of the corner of his eye. A slower step landed closer. Sentinel. A jolt thumped Auric's heart as he heard Varanthia's rasped whisper. He turned, lifted his sword and gasped. Lowering his blade, he rushed forward and caught the falling elf. As her light body landed in his arms, she dropped the egg. It landed with a hollow thump and rolled. My lady, what? He halted as he looked down at her mangled body. As if she had been attacked by an adult dragon, her armour was ripped apart. Deep gouges were carved across her chest and down her right leg. Half of her right hand was missing, tiny bones jutting out of flesh like bloodied white saplings. The right side of her face, ear and hair had been singed. Blood trickled down into Auric's lap and arms. What happened? Where's Garost? He fought the urge to vomit as Varanthia's hands began to tremble. Tears flowed down the side of her face, fading from clear to red before they soaked into her hair. Auric's eyes were widened. El. He shook his head. What is it? What happened? It's egg. Varanthia whispered as her brows twitched. I'll get it, Auric said quickly. Varanthia, what? He halted as she let out a long exhale, her body falling limp. Breathing quickly, he inspected her wounds again. He shook his head. No.
What could have done this? His heart pounded in his chest as he looked over at the egg. Though he knew the risks of taking the oath of sentinel, and he knew with every fibre of his being what potential the eggs held, he had never seen the orcs fight this hard. Slowly lowering Varanthia's body to the ground, he stood and gazed at the egg for a long moment. Then an unsettling realization crawled into Auric's mind. Was she running from someone? Something? What if she didn't kill it? He quickly looked back and forth at the horizon, though it was nigh pointless. The sun hadn't bathed the land yet. He could only see a few dozen feet in front of himself. Shit. His breaths became heavier the longer he stood, still squinting into the dark. Finding the will to move, he stepped backward toward his sword. After 4 slow steps, he knelt down and patted the ground with his hand, keeping his eyes to the southwest. His fingers found cold steel. Without looking down, he could recognize the smooth finish of the material more than any other metal. He was all too familiar with the fuller down the center of his blades. Sliding his hand down, his fingers brushed against the crossguard. Gripping the handle, he lifted the blade and stood. Just as he turned his eyes to the egg, something whipped by in the distance, a dark blur. Auric pulled his sword in tight, the hilt a hand's width from his chest. Take egg. Varanthia's words ran through his mind. Clenching his jaw, he cursed under his breath and made his move. In 2 quick bounds, he reached Varanthia and knelt down to unfasten her cloak. While it would have been faster to snag the egg and bolt to the north, half of a life's worth of ingrained instinct told him to never touch a dragon egg. Human hands are unworthy to behold such an honour to their flesh, Auric had been told on the 2nd day, after taking the oath to join the elven court with Morrow. Morrow, Auric thought quickly as he tugged the cloak away from her body. His heart sank at the mere thought of his best friend's possible whereabouts. With a quick twist, he threw the cloak over the egg and picked it up, found his footing, and ran. Like never before, he sprinted. He aimed north, pressed his boots into the soft soil, and ran without the elves to protect him. As he veered left and right to dodge deceased trees, Auric heard something impossible behind him, something that made him skip to a halt and turn around. "Move your ass, kid," a voice echoed in the dim light. Auric's heart leaped in his chest. He would recognize that voice from anyone. Francel? Without a thought, he turned back and sprinted in the direction of Varanthia's body. "Where are—" His words were cut short, as something hard struck out from behind a tree and cracked him in the forehead. He landed on his back, his sword and the egg once again landing on the ground. The surface of his forehead burned hot. Pulsating agony rippled through his head as his ears rang. Stepping out from behind the tree, and standing over the top of him, was Captain Francel, a giant branch in his hand. Fuck. Bright starlets flickered before Auric's eyes as he struggled to see clearly. Why did he hit me? His thoughts came slowly. Then a single thought invaded his mind, washing away all other questions. Take egg. Groaning, he rolled to the side and wiped his forehead with the back of his hand, painting it dark red. Lying beside him was the egg, unblemished still, albeit covered in dirt now. Slowly reaching out, his fingertips pushed the cloak to the side, and he touched the smooth surface. A surge of hot energy filled his body. As if the sun had touched down from the sky and enveloped him in a searing light, he screamed. The pain in his forehead was but a scratch compared to the burning inside his chest. He clutched it, finding it impossible to suck in a breath, as an invisible pressure crushed his ribs. Another scream barely escaped his breath, before the world fell into darkness. Chapter 7. Infancy.
Auric awoke with a gasping start. Jumping to his feet, he roared and pressed his hand against his chest as the pressure burned inside. His breaths were heavy and quick. Birds chirped and flew away. Critters scurried under the cover of thick foliage. As the pain quickly faded, his vision cleared, his mind focused. He was standing in a forest. "Morrow," he whispered harshly. Did Morrow reach the trench? His throat was dry and scratchy, burning like the sting of fine liquor. He searched for his sword in the overgrowth that was hiding his feet. "Francel?" "You're awake." Auric whirled around, his fists elevated and prepared for a battle. He stood up straight as he saw the sharp eyes of Francel. "Sir, what happened? How did we get here? Where's Morrow and the others? Where—" His heart sank with panic. "Where's the egg?" "I'm happy to see you awake, kid," said Francel as he approached. "It's been 3 days. Thought I might have killed ye. But then—" He trailed off as he looked at the weeds behind Auric's feet. Auric vaguely remembered something solid as stone hitting him. He reached up and felt his forehead. There was no wound, no pain. Then what? He cocked his head to the side. As he walked towards the captain, he narrowed his eyes and asked, "What in the ever fuck is going—" He paused as he heard a light patter of steps and rustling of plants behind him. Turning around, he noticed the tall grass and weeds swaying side to side as something pushed through after him. It stopped. "Where's my sword?" Auric whispered. "Such was my reaction. Initially," Francel said with a sour tone. Bending over, he pulled the black blade from the grass by his feet. "Don't know where your other one is." The brush parted, and a small black reptilian head poked through and chirped. Auric dove backwards, reaching out for the sword, and tripped over his own feet. What the fuck? With brightly glowing golden eyes, the charcoal-coloured creature's head was triangular, like a lizard. But unlike a lizard, 2 small spikes protruded from the top of its scaly head. 4 small razor-sharp teeth stuck out from the crease of its mouth. It cocked its head sideways and chirped again, with the sound of a crow mixed with a cat's cry for milk. It was high-pitched and shrill, short but loud. Francel grabbed Auric by the tunic and pulled him to his feet. "That, kid, is something that should be impossible these days." Auric's eyes widened as he stared at the infant creature before him. Though he didn't need it said out loud, he knew what stood before him. A baby dragon. "I don't know how to say it any other way. The elves are gonna kill you." The dragon lowered itself to the ground with a flinch at Francel's sudden burst of laughter. Auric jerked his shoulder forward to remove Francel's hand. "What the hell are you talking about? Why would they want to kill me? And what is that?" He pointed at the hatchling. Francel cleared his throat. Pointing at the creature, he leaned towards Auric. "Never you mind that just yet. Just think, kid. Telling me you don't know what that—" "I know what it is, Captain," Auric growled. "I mean, what is it doing here? Where did it come from?" Even as he asked, he knew the answer. "What happened now?" Francel asked sardonically. He cupped his hands on his hips. "What does it look like to you?" He chuckled and cuffed Auric on the back. "Why don't you try calling for it?" Auric shot a glare at the captain. "Why?" "It's yours," said Francel. "Or you're his. Either way. Go on." Auric looked down at the small head. It reminded him of a snake, yet somehow held an ounce of cuteness. A memory sprang into his mind. The burning, the pain. He had touched the egg. "No." He shook his head. "Tell me it isn't what I think it is." All right, said Francel. He cleared his throat and sterned his voice. "If you won't call for it, then back up." Auric looked at Francel. The agony he was in after touching the egg crept to his forethought again, but this time it felt foreign, as if he was looking at himself in the memory. He slowly turned his gaze to the creature before him. His stomach churned, as he thought of the only possible explanation of what sat before him. As Auric's heart started racing, his eyes began to glisten. He shoved the sword into his sheath and swallowed a lump of emotions in his throat as he shook his head. Can it be? Just as his heart raced, a soothing energy filled Auric with warmth. He looked down at his chest. Without the need for explanation, and although he didn't know how he knew, he was certain the warmth was from the dragon. There was a tingle in his mind that made him feel connected on a deeper level than he could understand at the moment. He slowly knelt and held his hand out. Narrowing his eyes on the hatchling, he smiled. The dragon cocked its head and made a soft, high-pitched chirp. Its golden eyes flicked upward toward Francel. It sank low to the ground. Auric furrowed his brows and glanced back at Francel. I don't think it likes you much, sir. Francel slowly nodded. He doesn't like half of me. Quirking a brow, Auric stood and turned to face the captain. What do you mean? Francel took several deep breaths, his eyes darting back and forth to Auric, then the hatchling. With a long sigh, he interlocked his fingers behind his head and peered toward the canopy above. I'm a Hafferan. Auric's brows raised slowly. Half elf, half. I know what a Hafern is, sir, Auric interrupted. I think we all speculated for some time. Francel looked down at the foliage and snorted. Of course you did. Being as it is, half elf means I have much knowledge of the elves. He turned and muttered. It's honestly probably why they keep me in the trenches. Auric cleared his throat and shook his head. What knowledge do you have? Why? Have you ever heard of the term Elmerian? Francel asked quickly. His jaws twitched as he locked eyes with Auric. No, Auric said slowly, narrowing his eyes as he folded his arms. He shrugged. What is it? During the Third Age, there was an elven prophet named Terriana, Francel said. He looked at the dragon and took a deep breath. She predicted something called an Elmerian, a human dragon mage. Auric rolled his eyes. He had heard of prophecies and fortune-tellers in the cities, but he knew all too well it was a scam for coin. Predicted, huh? Francel nodded. She foretold of a great power even the elves could not counter. Auric stared at Francel for a moment, then found himself laughing as he turned and knelt toward the hatchling again. Yeah, I'm sure that's accurate, he said. The dragon's head bobbed as it sniffed the air. As Auric held his hand out, the hatchling ran forward. Auric's heart jolted as the dragon ran headfirst into his leg. For a moment he thought it might bite him. Instead, the dragon shook its head like a wet dog, then pressed up against him. He grinned. Never seen a hatchling before. Humans were never meant to, said Francel. Despite the fact that I am half an elf, my mother was human, so I tend not to share the same ideas as my father's side. But this... He paused and walked in front of Auric, pointing at the dragon as he shook his head. Should never have happened. Perhaps he meant to hatch for Varanthia. Auric's stomach churned. Varanthia. A flood of memories raced in his mind. She was murdered. That's what orcs do, kid. Auric shook his head. No, this was something else. I've never seen wounds like that. Francel narrowed his eyes. What do you think I was running from? A hot sensation of hunger panged Auric's stomach. He curled up his lip as he clutched his belly. What's wrong? Francel asked quickly, his eyes widening. Auric shook his head. Just feel like I'm starving. You probably are, Francel said, and he probably is. He grinned at the hatchling. And you're pushing it into your dragon mage, aren't you? Auric quirked a brow and looked up, realizing Francel was staring at the dragon. What are you talking about? I'm not a dragon mage, Francel said with a light laugh, but I think I know enough about them to teach you the basics. Auric paused and stood. A hatchling curled up between his feet, its tail wrapping around Auric's ankle. I'm not a dragon mage, sir, There's just been some misunderstanding or something.
Stop calling me sir, Franzel said sternly.
He looked between Auric and the dragon again and sighed.
Whether you like it or not, dragons do not make mistakes when it comes to their choosing of a bond. When they first emerge into the world, they know who they've bonded with. They are fragile, therefore it's instinctual for them to shy away from anyone else.
Auric held his hands up.
Just stop, sir. Humans can't be dragon mages. We learned that from a young age. Such foolish dreams of children. And even if there was a possibility, do you think dragons are like mutts people drag into their house and domesticate? Franzel asked, his voice louder than it needed to be. Dragons choose who they want to bond with. It changes both dragon and rider. Did you feel a tinge of energy in your chest when you woke?
Auric opened his mouth to speak, then halted, his mind filling with the painful recollection only moments ago.
Why? Because you've been chosen, Franzel snapped, his eyes hardening as he pointed at Auric's chest. That pain you felt was a shock to the body from your new art delay.
Auric narrowed his eyes with confusion.
When you what? Art delay, Franzel said with a huff. It's Valerian, means heart spark, though most just call it an art. It's the physical manifestation of your power, locked away inside the soul connection of dragon and dragon mage.
Another swell of hunger came. With an audible growl, Auric's stomach boiled inside.
I need to forage, or hunt.
He looked down to find the hatchling staring at him.
That's a combination of his hunger and yours, said Franzel. You'll need to learn to separate those in your mind, lest you see yourself fall into insanity. Dragons can eat almost an eighth of their weight in one sitting. How do you know all this? Auric asked. When you've watched the turn of the century 5 times over, you find yourself obtaining knowledge you could never gain in a human lifetime. You're 500 years old? Auric asked, half not believing the captain. Just over, said Franzel. The elves have for long thought Haverns would side with them in any and all disputes. But even as I stand here today and talk of prophecies and destinies, I know you, Auric, and I don't foresee you being the bane of Verilia.
Auric pursed his lips and stepped back into a kneel. Reaching out slowly, he pet the top of the dragon's head, which was barely wider than his fist, its length less than Auric's forearm.
And what of Varanthia? Garrost? I don't know what happened to Garrost, Franzel said with a glimmer of venom. He likely made to return home to Bor Misari.
Auric thought about how mangled the elf's body had been.
With a word about Varanthia, no doubt. I'd be more concerned about him. Franzel gestured to the hatchling. You know what happens to a dragon mage if the dragon dies.
Of course, Auric knew that much.
Everyone knows so.
He shook his head. A shame it was to hear stories of riders who outlived their dragons, lost in their mind, most simply became uncivilized and too dangerous. Many over the millennia were put down, like rabid dogs.
Damn it, kid, hissed Franzel. I'm no longer your superior in any political sense. You're a rider now, and soon I'll be inferior to you in every aspect of life and death.
Auric narrowed his eyes. Another stab of hunger. He ignored it.
What do you mean? You are dense.
Franzel cocked his head to the side. Has anyone ever told you that?
Not often, Auric said.
Something chattered, then moved beneath the shrub. The hatchling perked its head up and slowly turned around. Its head bobbed again as it sniffed the air. To the ground went its pointed snout. Auric's heart started racing with excitement. He recognized at once that it was not his own feeling, but a foreign impulse influencing his body and tugging on his mood, and it was coming from a critter he couldn't care less for at the moment. But he looked down to find the dragon facing the disturbance. It was crouching low, its entire body dead still, with the exception of its tail whipping back and forth. The weeds jiggled again. At once, the dragon leaped. Auric was impressed with the hatchling's agility, one that could rival a house cat. As it dove, it vanished into the greenery. Auric's eyes widened. He immediately felt an ominous sense of worry. "Hey!" he yelled, waving his hand back and forth. "Get out of there! Leave it alone!" After 5 seconds of thrashing and high-pitched growls, the dragon reappeared, walking backward as it dragged a squirrel in its jaws. The brown rodent was nearly half of its size, yet its weight held nothing to the obsidian hatchling. Auric sighed and cupped his hands on his hips. "Really?" The hatchling tugged, took a few steps back, paused, and tugged again. At last it dropped the squirrel several feet from Auric. It looked up at him, and for a moment Auric would have swore the dragon was smiling, if he didn't know better. It let out a soft chirp, and sank its tiny teeth into the squirrel again to drag it a little closer. When the hatchling looked up at Auric, he realized what the infant was offering. Without a fire, game meat, especially of the rodent class, could be a fatal dinner if consumed raw. "Oh," he said with a grin. You go ahead." He looked at Francel, who stood still with a wide grin. "What? Still think it just hatched without choosing its rider?" Auric pursed his lips and watched the hatchling rip into the side of the squirrel. Using its front paws, equipped with razor-sharp claws, it tore into the skin, pulled back on the sinew of a leg until it removed a lump with a horrid sound. "Whatever the case," Auric said after a long moment of silence, "I can't keep him." "Keep him?" Francel growled. "Auric, he isn't a god's damned pet." He scoffed and threw his hand up. "Here I am, offering my help, regardless of my confidence that Bor Masari will want your head for this, and you, what? You want to get rid of it?" His face was reddening now as his breaths quickened. "Perhaps he did choose wrong. And what of my parents?" Auric snapped back. "If it is as you say, I can't go on the run forever, especially dragging this thing around with me." Francel shook his head and took several steps away from Auric. "Of all the sentinels I've ever been in charge of, I figured you would understand more than any other. Were you just following orders? Is that all?" "No," Auric said quickly, furrowing his brows. He paused and sighed. "I believe in the cause." He looked down at the hatchling. "But this ain't it, Captain." "How is it not?" Francel growled, whirling around to face Auric with narrowed eyes. He pointed at the dragon. "Because you suddenly have more responsibility. Do you know how many other humans would kill to be chosen by a fucking dragon, let alone the orcs?" "How many elves still believe this prophecy about a human dragon mage?" Auric asked. Before Francel could answer, he added, "And we'll take it to Bor Masari. They have mentalists that can determine the truth, that this is not my doing, nor is it something I want." Francel swallowed and walked back to Auric. "Kid, you're going to get yourself and a newborn dragon killed. For nothing." Auric's stomach churned. "I don't believe that, and I'd rather be up front and in the open to the elves than to have them hunt me down, potentially bringing my parents into this." A tingling feeling of guilt washed through him, even as he said these words. He averted his gaze from the hatchling, even as he could feel the sensation of hunger dissipating. Francel pointed a finger at Auric and glared. "You're making a mistake. Mark my words, kid." Auric sighed and knelt again. Cocking his head to the side, he studied the hatchling for a moment while it ate. So strange. A baby dragon. The creature before him perked its head up and turned to face him. A sensation creeped over his mind, though once again it felt distant, as if he was hearing a tale from someone in the far. It was muffled, echoing and nearly inaudible, but there were notes, like a song, perhaps a question. One thing was clear, though, an idea. Mine. Auric's heart began racing. Was the dragon naming himself Auric's hatchling? Was he naming Auric as his own? Narrowing his eyes, he held his hand out toward the hatchling. "You're definitely no dog." "I'm gonna go gather some firewood," said Francel,
if I can find any without treason. Auric largely ignored his former captain, though he knew what the half-born meant. His eyes slowly panned to the forest. Dense evergreen trees reached toward the skies, reminding him of the first time he had laid eyes on the Vrellingard forest. He looked back at the hatchling. He needed a name. Another flash of feelings washed over Auric's mind, and then a small voice. It was young, yet it felt adult. As it touched Auric's mind, he jerked his hand back and stood. His heart pounded in his chest. "What?" he blurted. He swallowed a lump in his throat and looked around for Franzel, but the captain was already gone. The hatchling jumped to its feet and flicked its head back and forth as it looked toward the trees. Auric felt a wave of fear fill his mind. "Hey," he said softly to the dragon as he looked at the trees. His hand naturally reached back for his sword as he scanned the perimeter. The dragon ran toward Auric and nestled against his ankles again. "It's all right." With an easy pull in his sword to remove it silently from its sheath, Auric slowed his breathing. In the distance, dead ahead, 100 paces or so, someone ran between two trees. A chill creeped down his spine. Only elves can move that fast, or druids. We're too far south for druids. Maybe one from the caravan made it this far. Then Auric remembered Falore's final spell. None of the elves made it out of that alive. His heart jolted as he remembered one more elf who survived the raid. Garrost? Chapter 8. Telton. Morrow woke and winced as the full moon stabbed his eyes with her light. His temple pulsated with sharp, painful throbs. He was on his side. Something cold bound his wrists. Grunting, he slowly sat up. He quickly realized he was on a wagon of sorts. Protruding from the sides were massive bones reaching toward the sky like white fingers. The roof was made of wood. Looking down, he saw what the cold bite was on his wrists. Wrought iron shackles locked his hands closely together. They were tethered to a chain mounted to the floorboard. He looked around, his pulse quickening as he noticed 14 other faces, dimly lit by the pale light. While he knew by their armor they were sentinels, he recognized none of them. "Wakey, wakey." His heart jolted though as he made eye contact with the man across from him. He had a thick black beard and shaggy hair. "Auric?" The man leaned forward. "No, lad. Rayton's the name." Morrow let his shoulders relax. "Oh, right. Of course." Rayton lifted his bushy brows. "Who might you be?" Morrow looked around the wagon as it lurched forward. He looked to the front and saw the backside of a massive bear. She was harnessed like a stallion, pulling the cart across uneven ground. From the sound of wooden wheels against stones, he guessed there were at least 4 wagons. He looked back at Rayton. Morrow. In front of the wagon, he could hear other wheels on the rocky ground, but he couldn't see other wagons. "Where are we going?" Rayton shrugged. "Who knows?" Glancing to his right, Morrow saw a woman whose skin was darker than his own. Her face was pointed to the floor, eyes closed. He looked down at his left hip, then turned and looked at his right hip. "If you're looking for your weapon, friend, it's gone," said Rayton. "Sit back and shut your traps, would you?" the woman called from the front of the wagon. Something about the woman's tone sent a fire into Morrow's chest. Words poured from his lips before he gave them a full thought. "Who are you?" The woman, who was visibly older than the rest of the group, even in the shallow light, inclined her brows. She cocked her head and narrowed her eyes on Morrow. "I'm captain." "You're nobody's captain here," the woman beside Morrow interrupted. The woman at the front scoffed. "And you are?" "Nisha," the woman next to Morrow said dryly. The left side of her head was shaved down, while the hazel-coloured hair on her right side was smooth and ran down below her ear. The older woman sank back against the bone railings. The moonlight shone against the silver streaks in her hair. "Well then," she said, her voice dropping to a reserved defeat. She glanced out into the darkness. "I was Captain Milena of the southwestern trenches." Morrow took a deep breath. He was unsurprised by the hostility of the sentinels. He felt it in his bones, the drive to escape, to kill the orcs who had slaughtered his company. "We're going to get out of here." Raken snorted. "Downright doubt that'll happen." "We will," Morrow said, even as he doubted his own words. "How?" Nisha questioned, whipping her face toward Morrow as she leaned closer. "We have no weapons. We have fewer numbers, and in case you hadn't noticed." She lifted her hands and shook her chain. "We're slaves now." Morrow tried to imagine how the others were captured. He thought of Calder and heard the kid's screams all over again. It wasn't until he felt the bright burning of his nails digging into his palms that he realized he clenched his fists so tightly. "How did they get you?" he asked, directing his question at anyone who would answer. A man sitting diagonally across from him answered first. "Sangrabors burned our trench. I was a scout, so I was on the ground and..." He looked down and frowned. "You didn't see them coming?" Milena asked. The man shook his head, though his eyes remained on the wagon floor. Morrow's heart sank. "Don't be too hard on yourself. Could any of your men fight Sangrabors?" "One of mine could have," said Milena. "She was a witch." Morrow rolled his eyes. "Sure. Sangrabors aren't as big as Hargrals or as fast as Valravs, but they're the Furin users of the orcs." "No witch can match a Sangrabor," added Nisha. Raken quirked a brow. "A witch," he said with a smirk. "Not an actual witch." Milena huffed. "Sasha was plenty useful and valuable as a spellcaster." As the warbear continued pulling the wagons, the sentinels talked about their journey until they had been abducted by the orcs. Morrow began to realize how organized Asgrim had been during their raid. Several of the sentinels began dozing off. Morrow looked around as a question formed in his mind. He gave voice to the thought. Orcs don't usually leave survivors if they can help it. And this wasn't about taking slaves. "So?" Raken asked. Morrow swallowed and looked toward the moon. "So what do they want with a few dozen sentinels? Especially only one from each unit?" The only response to his question was the subtle rattle of chains and wood against stone as the wheels continued on into the night. After another hour, all of the sentinels were asleep, with the exception of Morrow. He sat quietly and let the shifting weight of the wagon lull him into a waking dream of memories. Before he realized it, into the early hours of the morning, just before the sun was birthed into the sky, he too drifted to sleep. "Up!" an orc roared and smashed a fist against the side of the wagon. Morrow jerked awake with a start. He squinted at the sun beating down above and lifted his hand to overshadow his face. Only then he remembered he was shackled to the floor and couldn't lift his hands higher than his shoulders. "Fuck," he groaned. Blinking rapidly, he looked around the cage and saw the other 14 sentinels were awake and clear-eyed. They'd been awake for a while. Glancing over his shoulder, he noticed a small town in the distance. The land was bleak and flat. Far to the north he saw the ash-coloured scar. They had travelled hundreds of miles. He racked his brain, trying to guess what town they had come to. Morlin? "No," Nisha said coldly. "Telton." "What are we doing here?" Morrow questioned. Realizing none of the others would know, he turned around as far as he could within the limits of his chains. An orc stood 6 feet from the wagon, his massive back turned to the humans. "Why are we here?" The orc barely turned his head. just enough to flash a bright green eye at Morrow. He snarled and stepped back. "Silence, you!" He slammed his elbow against the bone wall, shaking the wagon. Morrow clenched his jaw and turned back around in his seat. He looked at Raken, then Nisha. "Have any of you heard of orcs raiding human towns lately?" "Never heard of it at all," Raken said. Nisha cast her eyes to the floor. "I haven't heard of it since before I joined the court." Morrow swallowed a dry spell in his throat. "When was that?" 8 years ago." Morrow lifted his brows. 8 years. "Stick around and you could last as long," she said with a half shrug. "Aye," said Raken. "Nearly there myself." "Most don't last that long," said Belena. "They either get murked or they quit. Either way, Sentinel of the Elven Court is not a position meant for longevity." "What about you, Captain?" asked Raken. "I see you're silver." Belena narrowed her eyes. 12 years. Morrow cleared his throat, then coughed. If 8 years seemed like a decent amount of time to spend with the Elven Court, and Belena had been a captain at 12 years, he wondered what they would think of his 16 years. "All right, Morrow?" asked Raken. Morrow pursed his lips and nodded. "Fine." Nisha turned her eyes toward him slowly. "How long have you?" 16 years, Morrow said, turning his gaze to Telton. A silent tension filled the wagon for several minutes. It was palpable. Without looking, he knew the others were gawking at him now. The hairs on the back of his neck stood as goosebumps crawled down his arms. At last, Belena spoke first. "You were a commander as well." Morrow exhaled, letting go of the breath he was unknowingly holding. He shook his head. "I was not. My brother." He paused and thought of Arik. Where is he? Looking at Belena, he cleared his throat, something that was becoming more difficult to do as his mouth was dry. "My brother and I joined as soon as we were both 16. "You joined?" asked the man sitting next to Raken, whom Morrow had gathered through conversations held the name Agram. He snorted and looked around at the wagon. "Nobody joins. We're selected and sent." Morrow shook his head. Before he could protest, Raken cocked his head and spoke first. "Don't you hear my accent?" Agram furrowed his brows. "What of it?" "I joined the court. Obviously, I'm not from around here," said Raken. Such was true to Morrow's ears as well. He couldn't place what region Raken had been from, but he guessed it was not Varillion. "My brother and I joined together," he said slowly. "Not my blood brother, but still." Heavy footfalls grew louder, bringing a silence to the sentinel's conversation. They all turned their heads toward the rear of the wagon. Morrow's heart leaped as he saw General Tharlock walking up to the back gate. Shit. From his thick black leather belt, Tharlock withdrew a set of keys. After a few seconds, he shoved it into a lock on the rear door. Then he opened the bone gate, letting it swing back all the way until it bumped on the orcs standing beside the back right wheel.
"Out, all you."
Morrow's chest grew tight. He wanted to protest, to fight, but he had learned the hard way such an endeavour was futile. Tharlock was not an orc easily defeated. Regardless, he held up his fists and shook his manacles. "Let us out." An orc walked behind Tharlock, his face shrouded behind a wide hood. With a single wave of his hand, swirls of purple energy glowed inside the locks of the sentinel's shackles. With a single mechanical click, all 15 pairs of restraints opened, then dropped to the floor. The chains rattled so loud it was jarring.
"Now,"
said Tharlock.
"Out."
Raken was the first to exit. Morrow watched as Agram and Nisha followed. What he was waiting on, he didn't know. But he sat as all 14 sentinels moved out of the wagon. With a sigh, he stood. Reluctantly, he finally stepped down from the cart.
"Stretch legs,"
Tharlock commanded, pointing at the sentinels with a wide knife. "What are we doing?" Milena asked, pushing her way to the front of the group. The stiff-chested stance she took showed the others an air of command that she must have had as a captain. She cupped her hands on her hips and stared up at Tharlock, unafraid.
"Need things,"
Tharlock said. He pointed towards Telton.
"More Kune not buy. Human buy for Kune."
"You want us to go shopping for you?" questioned Nisha. She snorted. "Get fucked."
"You go or one die,"
Tharlock said. Swifter than anyone could react, he lunged forward and grabbed Agram by the throat. Hoisting the sentinel off of the ground with apparent ease, he set Agram down beside him. Morrow and the other sentinels gasped and took a step closer to Tharlock. Morrow had a half of a mind to turn and sprint toward Telton, only to continue running until he reached the Vrelingard. But it was a moot point. He'd never escaped the Valravns and their riders, the Valrav. Until that point, he had only seen 6 pairings, but that far exceeded what they'd need to catch him, or worse. Agram gasped and rubbed his throat. "Please, just let me go."
"No,"
said Tharlock.
"You go,"
he added, pointing his butcher knife at Milena. Reaching behind his left side, he produced a leather satchel. He handed it to Milena. Turning, she looked at Telton from their distance. She sighed. "What do you want?"
"I get list,"
said Tharlock. He gave the sentinels a stern glare, reattached the keyring to his belt, and walked away. Morrow observed with curiosity when the Sangrabor handed a large piece of parchment to Milena. For all their capture and melt-forced rule under the Orcs, he had begun respecting the former captain. Despite their situation, she hadn't hesitated to keep the Orcs' focus. Next, the Sangrabor, his face hidden beneath his hood, handed Milena a pouch of coins.
"Do not run. You will be executed."
Morrow cocked his head. Even with the Orc's quick words, he recognized a superior speech than that of Tharlock, or even a few other Hargrels. Once the Sangrabor walked away, he stepped closer to Milena. "What's on the parchment?" Turning slowly, she tapped the golden paper against the pouch. "It's a merchant's list." Morrow furrowed his brows and whirled around to face the general, who was now several paces in front of the wagon. "Why the fuck should we do their bidding? They can't get into Telton without causing mass chaos, so they'd rather us fetch their supplies." Nisha shook her head. "Fuck that." "We must," said Milena. "What for?" asked Raken. "We're either slaves or we're dead, are we not?" Morrow stepped in front of Milena. Her eyes were downcast at the parchment and pouch. "What's going on in that head of yours?" "We have to do what they say," she said softly. Finally, she looked up into Morrow's eyes. "You've been a sentinel long enough. You should know how shifting power and leverage works." "I do," said Morrow. "But I believe nobody should have the power to force others to their will." Milena looked at the other sentinels in their group. "If we defy them, we die. Or, more likely, they'll kill one of us. Then they'll try again. Each death will be a point of leverage." She shrugged. "There are enough of us to make it painful for the ones who survive." Morrow folded his arms and grinded his teeth together as he rolled his eyes. Fuck, she's right. Agram stepped forward and held his hand out. "Give me that shit. I'll throw it as far as I can." "So they can start killing us?" Milena questioned with a growl. She scoffed. "Have you no sense of honor?" "Honor is gone," said Agram, Our oaths are but whispers in the wind. Our duty is to none but ourselves. I say, we make a run for it. Raken clapped his hand on Agram's shoulder. And I say, you do just that. If anything, it'll let us know how expendable we are. Morrow cocked his head. Expendable, he muttered, and narrowed his eyes. You think there's a reason we're still alive? Why they've taken us? I do, said Raken. Don't think I'll voice my ideas yet, though. Give it to me, Agram said with a colder tone. When Milena stood unmoved, he reached for the parchment and pouch. I said. Morrow grabbed Agram's hand and twisted his wrist. Nisha kicked the backside of Agram's knee, dropping him into a kneel. As he fell, she wrapped her arm around his throat and squeezed. Are you turning on your own kind now? She growled into his ear. Morrow kept a strong hold on Agram's wrist. We're in this together, are we not? None of you are part of my company, said a man behind Raken. He was younger than most of the other sentinels in the group. His shoulder-length blonde hair was pulled back in a ponytail. The fluff on his chin was wiry and in disarray.
Morrow had heard his name only once, and thus had forgotten it.
We all took the same oath. Stand down, Rain, said Milena, pointing at the man who spoke up. Rain, thought Morrow. We're in this together, whether any of us like it or not. Look around. There are sentinels and there are orcs. Is it any different than it always has been? Agram tapped Nisha's forearm and coughed. She let go, giving him a shove as she stood to her full height. Morrow's heart was racing, though it only occurred to him once Agram had given up on his argument. He looked down at the parchment clenched tightly in Milena's hand. We'll go. We'll do what they want for now. If anything, only to survive. If it comes to a fight, Agram said, coughing as he stood. He rubbed his neck and glared at Nisha. If it comes to a fight, I'll kill every single one of you to save my own ass. Morrow shook his head. I'm not surprised. Just because we're all sentinels doesn't mean we're all good people. He stepped closer to Agram and narrowed his eyes. You step up to try to take charge of anyone's choices again, and I'll personally see you don't catch your breath next time. As Milena was the one given the list and pouch of coin, she departed the group and met up with a single person from each group. Now that they had stopped, Morrow had a chance to fully take in the gravity of how many sentinels there were in the group. 6 wagons were as full or fuller than the one he had been chained to. Though several had tried to leave their groups, Hargrels quickly stepped in to keep them segregated. An eerie feeling creeped up his spine. He shivered, recognizing the familiar feeling that he was being watched. Slowly turning around, he locked eyes with the hooded Sangrabor who had unlocked their shackles. The orc cocked his head, flashed a smirk, then turned away. What is it? Asked Raken. Morrow stiffened. Nothing. Just need to pay attention. What's going on here? What do you mean? Morrow looked around. He had started counting how many Hargrels, Valravs and Sangrabors had been assigned to each wagon. They have a system here. Raken looked around. Obviously. Don't know if you can tell or not, but they aren't exactly the mindless monsters we are led to believe. So what if they have a system? They're just a number now. We are, Morrow said. He took a deep breath and folded his arms. But I intend to break this system they have. You planning on escaping? Asked Nisha, walking up behind Morrow. Morrow narrowed his eyes at her, then pointed at the Valravs. Touching his finger to his ear, he hoped she understood his warning. Unlike the Hargrels and Sangrabors, the Valravs' ears were slightly longer and wider. This made their hearing extraordinary amongst hunters, and there was no better hunter than the Valravs. Nisha leaned back and looked around Morrow and Raken. When? Morrow swallowed a dry patch in his throat. Soon. Need to pay attention for a bit, but soon. Chapter 9. The Half-Blood's Return. A head poked out from behind a tree. Sentinel. Stepping fully into the light, Garost walked towards Auric, though his head was on a swivel as he scanned his surroundings. You live. Auric's heart continued to race. He glanced down at the dragon. The feeling of fear, or the presence of an enemy, whatever was causing the hatchling to cower, was putting Auric on edge. He held his sword firm, its point facing the elf. As do you, I see. Garost's eyes fell on the hatchling, and widened as he came to a halt. It hatched. Auric narrowed his eyes. Don't play dumb with me. You have eyes like the eagles that saw the sky. You saw him. Garost straightened himself, folding his hands together in front of his hips. His look of utter surprise faded. So I did. How long have you been tailing us? Auric asked sternly, trying to force the fear of the elf into something darker, angrier. Fear was an old emotion that Auric had learned to burn out of his soul years ago. Fear causes hesitation and death. For whom did the dragon hatch? Asked Garost. Interesting you didn't ask about Varanthia first, Auric answered. I know you elves aren't the sentimental type, but I found our Lady Varanthia 2 nights ago. Garost's tone turned cold, emotionless. I assume she is the one he chose. Auric quirked a brow. He? Glancing down at the dragon, he muttered. So you're a he. Garost scoffed. Lowly-minded sentinel. Of course he is male. Yet another reason to fuel my suspicion that he is not yours. The dragon let out a growl, or Auric assumed it was a growl. If it wasn't threatening. But nonetheless, one thing was clear. He didn't like Garost. Auric slid a foot in front of the hatchling slowly, and tightened his grip on his sword. What happened to her? She was murdered, Garost said, his eyes flicking toward Auric's blade. And you think I killed her? Auric questioned. His blood began to boil with anger. Where did you two go? I woke up and you were both gone. We were scouting for food beyond the plague of the dead pine. Garost looked at the dragon again. She took him, still in the egg, mind you, and we ventured in different directions. What's going on here? Franzel called from the woods. Though he carried a bundle of thin, sickly branches, he had silently returned. Garost drew a dagger from behind his hip and spun to face Franzel, dipping into a fighting stance. Captain Franzel, how splendid. He stood up straight and began speaking Valerian. We can speak in common tongue in front of Auric, Franzel interrupted. Garost's eyes twitched. He took in a long breath and glanced at Auric. Very well. Was this sentinel under your charge? Nice of you to clean up the language in your translation, Franzel said. He walked toward Auric. And yes, he was, but no longer. Might I query as to the reason he is no longer beneath you? Garost rolled his eyes and returned his dagger. And why does he face me with ill intent, his blade at the ready as if he sees a victory? Auric held still, though his weight-bearing leg began to burn. For now, he would ignore it. He knew the agility of elves, and Garost was close enough to close the gap within a second should he wish. He is no longer under my charge because he is no longer a sentinel. No, he is a dragon mage, said Franzel, as he tossed the sticks down behind Auric. He looked at Auric for a moment before snorting. And he's ready to fight, because he's not a fucking idiot. Garost's eyes widened. You dare speak to... He halted and jerked his head back, as if to reset his thoughts. Pardon, but he is a human, yes? I am, Auric said dryly, and I'm standing right here if you've a question to ask. Garost's unblemished pale face reddened. His eyes twitched again. Dragons do not choose humans. If he hatched, he has chosen an elf, likely Varanthia before she died. Arik sensed the elf's frustration. Regardless of some old prophecy, it was plain to see humans were not meant to be dragon mages. He forced a smirk. The sensation of fear faded slightly. I don't know what to tell you besides that is exactly what happened. No, I didn't ask for it, and I will make sure. Garrost gave a quick and high chuckle. But of course you did not seek such glory. It is fit to rest only upon the shoulders of the worthy. No human can muster the might of— Shut the hell up, Garrost, Franzel hissed. You have no say nor inkling of what dragons desire. Garrost's face darkened as blood filled his cheeks. I will have your— Yeah, Franzel waved his hand. Arik plans to present the hatchling to the Elven court. He looked sideways at Arik. Against my opinion and advice, but regardless, he is the dragon mage. Do you find us so dull that we don't know what happens when a dragon mage dies? If it chose her, then he would be dead as well. Garrost looked back and forth between Arik and Franzel. He opened his mouth to speak. He was the one chosen, Franzel said as he pointed at Arik. I saw it myself. Garrost's brows shot up. You saw it? He shook his head. Preposterous. And my guess is even if he is found to be telling the truth, you won't believe it, Franzel added. Arik's heart hammered in his chest. He would never have dreamed of speaking to a superior in such a way. Yet, listening to Franzel, it was clear where the captain's loyalty lied. Garrost's eyes darted back and forth. You plan to bring him to Bor Masari? Allow me to take the dragon. I can move swifter and safer than the lot of you. His tone was dripping with condescendence. No, Arik said sternly. For whatever reason, he chose me. He stole a glance down at the hatchling, which stood as still as a statue. He couldn't understand why at the moment, but he felt a burning urgency to protect the hatchling. He knew in his soul he would kill to save the infant. This is a dragon we're talking about. I'm not letting him out of my sight. As a member of the Elven court, I lay claim to the jurisdiction of command here, Garrost said, his voice gaining in volume. You wish you had that authority, Franzel said with a chuckle. If he had any fear or worries, he was doing a solid job of hiding it. There isn't an elf in this world who holds jurisdiction over the Vrelangard. The groves would usher your head onto a pike for such claims alone. We will take him, said Arik. You are more than welcome to aid us in our quest, if that would appease you. No. Garrost took a deep breath and tucked his hands behind the small of his back. It is dire that I report such an anomaly to the court. You do that, said Franzel with a narrow-eyed nod. And if Annie— Before he could finish, Garrost threw his dagger. Franzel lifted his hand in front of his chest. The blade pierced through with ease. He let out a cry of pain and spun around. All Arik saw was a blur heading toward him. Before he locked onto something solid with his eyes, he swung the broadsword downward diagonally. Garrost ducked under the blade and slammed Arik in the hip with a palm, sending him flying sideways. The dragon was kicked into the air. As Arik rolled, he kept a tight grip on his sword. Ignoring the pain in his left shoulder, he quickly got to his feet and lifted it. His heart sank. Franzel stood sideways beside the elf, the back of his hand pressed against Garrost's neck, the dagger through both his palm and the elf's throat. Franzel jerked his hand away. Blood sprayed from Garrost's punctured vein. I fucking knew it, Franzel yelled as he pulled the dagger from his hand. Garrost stumbled backward and clutched his neck, then dropped to a knee. His mouth opened and closed, like a fish suffocating on a lonely shore. See what I mean, kid? Franzel growled through heavy breaths.
They will kill you. Both. Turning the dagger around, he stepped forward, shoving Garrost's resisting hand away. With no mercy at all, he sliced across the elf's windpipe. A waterfall of red spewed as airy gurgle sounds came for only seconds. Then the elf fell forward to his chest, his eyes frozen open. Arek's stomach churned in a knot. He slowly rose to his feet and lowered his sword. Eyes widened, he swallowed a lump in his throat. You killed him. He immediately felt a pang of panic rush into his mind and shot a look over to see the dragon standing, seemingly unharmed. He ran over to the hatchling and knelt down. Are you all right, boy? You're welcome, Franzel said with a mockery of a bow. The hatchling chirped and looked over at Garrost. A new feeling and idea formed in Arek's mind. It was similar when the dragon had caught the squirrel. He stood and fought the urge to vomit. Are you insane? What? No, you can't eat him. Elves are not food. Franzel winced and threw the dagger at the ground. It stuck with a thud. Probably tastes like a bucket of fox. He dropped to his knees and began tugging bits of weeds out of the ground. Arek curled up his lip. A bucket of what? Franzel shook his head. Nothing. You should get a fire going. I'll want a flame perimeter set up before nightfall. Arek nodded. Yeah, I'll get on that. He looked at the hatchling, then Garrost. We'll need to rid our camp of the body as well. He walked toward the pile of sticks and paused to look at Franzel. Then I have a shitload of questions to ask you. Chapter 10. Sentinel Anew. Arek cocked his head to the side and narrowed his eyes at Franzel on the other side of the fire. Well, the captain was taking too long, eating a piece of rabbit that had crossed into their camp an hour ago. Using his front teeth, he picked morsels from tiny bones. Arek stabbed his sword into the ground. Sir, I said. I know what you said, Arek growled. Got your ravenous lips off that bone, didn't it? Now, answer me. Please. Franzel sighed and tossed the bone into the fire. None. Arek's stomach churned. He shook his head. I don't understand. How could none of them have survived? Thousands. None that I found, said Franzel, as he rested his chin on his knuckles. Maybe further west. Some of the trenches were missed. He shook his head and exhaled slowly. I don't know. I didn't go that way. But the orcs came from the west. I've never seen anything like it. Not in numbers or coordination. Morrow went. I found a few of his daggers. Franzel interrupted. Arek's eyes began burning as they welled with tears. Where? Maybe half a league from our trench. Franzel sighed and looked toward the abyss above. There was a lot of blood, kid. Tracks from a war bear as well, and Arek gripped the handle of his sword so tightly his arm began to tremble. And what? A leg, said Franzel. I think it was Calder's. I should have made him stay with us, Arek hissed. I should have... You're not one of the gods of fate, Arek, Franzel said as he leaned forward. You couldn't have known any more than I did what was destined to fall upon us. A flood of memories filled Arek's mind of him and Morrow, ranging from childhood to the warfront. We grew complacent. No, growled Franzel. The fuck? We grew complacent. We were sentinels, Arek Talendris. Better than any knight from Greyhorn to Ambermead. No human matched us. Don't do that to yourself, kid. The blame is on nobody's shoulders but Asgrim's. A hatchling began to whine and nuzzled against Arek's leg. As his sorrow deepened immediately, Arik sobbed. Then he realized his heartbreak was affecting the dragon. Wiping a tear from his beard, he bent down and picked up the dragon. It was heavier than he had expected. While his spikes appeared sharp and solid as stone, Arik was surprised when he brushed his hands against them. They were only as stiff as a relaxed finger. "It's all right, boy," Arik sniffled, and took in a deep inhale. The dragon curled up on his lap, laying his head on Arik's knee. "I see you two are already melding intentions," said Franzel. He nodded. "That's good." The words made sense to Arik, and though he had 1,000 questions to ask about the dragon, his mind lingered on Morrow. Maybe he escaped, ran away or something. Franzel nodded slowly. "Maybe. Perhaps we'll find him yet. But for now, you need to decide what you're going to do about him." Arik sighed and looked down. He needs a name. "And he'll give it once your art is strong enough," Franzel said. "First week's always the hardest. There are no words he can say. At least, not any you can understand. Once your bond strengthens, your mental link will allow you both to communicate properly." Arik shrugged. "So until then, I just, wait?" "Unfortunately," said Franzel. "He's to become a mighty force of magic and wisdom. But for now, he's a baby. He needs you more than you need him. One day, that may not be the case." Arik knew he was dodging the question. Even as he thought of the different outcomes, he thought of his parents in Ambermead. What would they say of Morrow? They, who helped raise him for 6 years, would be crushed. He took a deep breath. Dragon mages have magic, don't they? Franzel leaned back and narrowed his eyes. "They do. And you will. Though I don't think it'll be the same as elven mages. The stories of an Almerian speak of raw power, raw energy." Arik's chest grew tight. "Can you teach me?" "Perhaps," Franzel said with a nod. "Not yet, though. I know a bit about magics, at least the principle and theory of them. I would need to observe you for a while as your bond strengthens. If you're truly different from the elven dragon mages, it may prove difficult. We won't know until I witness how your power manifests." Arik sighed, deciding to come out with it. "I still aim to bring him to Bor Masari, but not until I know I can protect him. I will not spend my life running or looking over my shoulder. Kid, I'll face them head on." Arik's words were sharp, finite, a demand that was not up for debate. "I have to think of my parents." Franzel rubbed his face and inhaled quickly as he stood. "When was the last time you saw your parents?" Arik jerked his head back at the question. "Why? How long?" Chest growing tighter, Arik's heart quickened its pace. "Just over 3 years ago. Why?" "I didn't have the heart to tell you." Franzel trailed off. A knot formed in Arik's stomach. He started to rise to his feet, and halted as the hatchling stared. "Tell me what?" Franzel chewed the inside of his bottom lip as he stared for a long moment at Arik. "Ambermead has fallen into war with Mivornir." Franzel lifted his brows. They've been at war over the territories of Nurnatern and Menrim. And now..." Arik narrowed his eyes and shook his head. "Ambermead and Mivornir have been at war several times over the years. They've always fought for the land sprawled between them. I'll see my parents again." Franzel sat back down on his boulder. "Arik..." "Ambermead was evacuated." Arik's heart sank. Evacuated? His gaze fell to the forest floor.
No, that can't be right. Ambinweed would never, Queen Frigg would never... 2 months ago, said Francel quickly. They evacuated 2 months ago. Why the fuck didn't you tell me? Auric roared, his heart hammering with anger now. The hatchling looked up at Auric and chirped. Would you have abandoned your post? Francel asked coldly. Your oath. Auric opened his mouth to give his answer, then paused as he asked himself. He looked down. Would I have left? When he found himself answering in his mind, he shook his head. Grating the handle of his sword, he hissed between clenched teeth. God damn it. You wouldn't have, Francel said softly. I know you, kid. I also know it would have torn you inside out with guilt and worry. So I said nothing. Auric looked over at the hatchling. Everything that has led to this, or what? What the fuck is going on out there, sir? Wish I knew, Francel said, his face solemn. The orcs have taken the biggest step yet to seizing this land, even though they'd never migrate to the scar. The elves are doing nothing, and Paulus hasn't sent out a summons to Mavorna or Ambermead, as far as I know. I never thought Aergoth would push beyond the scar, Auric said. He recalled stories of the orcs fearing the Evermist. As far as I can see, they haven't, Francel said, as he picked up another small bone. He gnawed at it with his front teeth. Auric looked into the dark surroundings. Beyond the torches he had spread out around their makeshift camp, a thick black waited. A chill crawled up his spine. Beyond the torches could be any number of things waiting until the evergreen resin burned away. Why do they truly not venture this far? He asked, keeping his eyes on the perimeter. I've heard stories, but they clearly have the numbers now. Orcs are funny like that, said Francel. We know they follow the chieftain, Aergoth, the Bane of Bearmore, but they also have clans, generals under Aergoth, and a strong culture. They spread far to attack, but they dare not linger. With a home outside of Asgrim, at least in Virilia, they will always attack, then return home. Auric narrowed his eyes on Francel. How could they ever expect to win? I never said they were wise, Francel chuckled. Besides, it's in the orcs' nature that the elves find security. Not just elves, but King Paulus as well. King Paulus, Auric groaned. What a waste of life. Yet he's seen as the humans' faction's highest king above all, said Francel. He sucked a piece of meat out from between his teeth. After all, it is he who slept with the Bormissarians and gained their favour. It's under his law that men and women are sent to the trenches. That just makes him more of a shit stain, Auric said with an eye roll. He mulled Francel's answer over and snorted. So the orcs are just too homesick to really go for it. Francel didn't laugh. Not even a smirk crossed his face. It's been speculated for a long time that the orcs had their home stripped from them, wherever they came from. Why would this information not be taught to humans? Asked Auric. I'm sure it is, in the north, Francel said with a half smirk. Auric rolled his eyes again. Anything on the other side of the misty scar should be safe, right? Francel cocked his head sideways and lifted his brows. Auric rubbed his beard and sighed. We're 300 leagues from Bormissari. Francel looked down at the wound he had shoved weeds and dirt into. In the hours that had passed, the gash had sealed shut, an injury that would have taken weeks for a human to recover from. I'll never make it on foot. Auric quirked a brow. Why not? Sure, it'll take a while. We'd have time to see what becomes of this dragon bond. And with any luck, I'll develop a sense of magic. That way, if shit rolls downhill, I can at least fight Get him out of there. Or you could simply listen to me, Francel snapped. Shit is going to roll downhill, and it's going to bury you both. This is stupid, kid. I'm not arguing about this again, Auric said firmly, his glare hardening on the captain. You're either with us or you can haul your ass back to the mist. Francel's jaws twitched. Slowly nodding, he said, So, that's how it's going to be. I tell you I'm no longer your superior and you throw a massive fuck you, Captain Francel. Auric huffed. That isn't exactly what I meant. He thought about his words. His brows flicked upwards. But yeah, I guess I mean to say if you don't know what you meant. Francel coiled back. He ran his fingers through his hair, then threw his hand down. If you want to go, so be it. I'll accompany you, sure. But if you want my guidance with him, then you'll listen to what I have to say. Auric glanced down at the hatchling. Fine. We won't make it to Bor Masari on foot, because there'll be likely a wave or more of the elven court coming through the Vralengard. Francel lifted his brows. Unless you've forgotten that the dragon died. Auric swallowed. I haven't forgotten. He looked down. The hatchling is sleeping on my lap. So, Francel continued, I think we should make our way towards Dire Hollow, snag us some mounts and rations for a long journey, then head out. We stick to the forest. No worn routes or roads. If all goes well, we should be able to set a pace at 10 leagues a day. Auric's eyes widened. That's a month of steady moving. Francel grinned tauntingly. And it'll probably be longer than that if you have any desire to rest or keep the horses alive for the entire journey. He chuckled. And you wanted to travel by foot. Auric sat still for a long while, mulling over the captain's plan. After nearly a minute of silence, he nodded. Fine, we'll do that. But if the journey is so long, we're going to have to make stops along the way. Francel sat up straight, his eyes rolling about as if he were lost in thoughts of his own. Finally he nodded. Where are you thinking? I don't know, said Auric. We never take the eggs through the forest like that. I never made it up to Bor Masari. It's always just been straight to Alanore, which was a couple of weeks' journey from the Scar, and we always headed back to the trenches. Francel opened his mouth as if to say, Ah. He smiled. That's right. I always forget that you and Morrow never reached Bor Masari. Auric downcast his eyes to the ground upon hearing Morrow's name again. Well, one day he'll make it there as well. So that's settled then, said Francel. He rose to his feet and stretched his arms to the skies with a groan. We'll head to Bor Masari and prove you're worthy. Yeah? Auric nodded and yawned. Sounds about right. I feel I must warn you, Auric. Oh, it shouldn't need to. Should anyone see him, anyone at all, he'll need to be taken care of. Auric's stomach lurched. He knew what taken care of meant. It was one thing for the elves to find them before they were ready to be confronted. It was entirely different for humans, the most social race in the world, to see a human dragon mage or a baby dragon. I understand. No, you don't, Francel said, as he lay down on the ground. Tucking his hands under his head as his back touched the undergrowth, he muttered, But you will. Auric looked down at the hatchling. Why did you choose me? The next morning, Auric awoke to a scratching on his eyelid. With a start, he jumped up and reached for the sword sticking into the ground. A quick scuffle at his feet revealed the dragon staring up at him. An idea swam into his mind. Mine. Rubbing his face, he realized the hatchling must have licked him. He chuckled and let go of the sword. Yeah, boy. Mine. He spoke to you, Francel said. Auric turned to see the captain sitting on his boulder. His hands hovered over smouldering embers. Not exactly. I get these ideas or feelings through him. It was quite a bit clearer this morning, though. Francel stared at the dragon for a long moment. So, I have a theory on something, he said, as he stirred and rubbed his palms together. Of course, only time will tell. Auric yawned and wiped the crust from the corner of his eyes. What theory do you have? Elven dragon mages' bonds grow over time, said Francel. It's said that their bond relies on wisdom and time. Elves are essentially immortal, some living for over 5 millennia. Auric shook his head and shrugged. All right. I don't think your bond will be the same. Francel shook his head. If I had to guess, your bond will grow with your connection. Auric narrowed his eyes. What? Humans are emotional beings, said Francel. He laughed. Fuck, I'm half human, and I can say that with ease and pride. It makes humans who they are, for better or worse. I think your bond will rely on something like emotion more than wisdom, or simply time. Auric wiped the corners of his mouth. Just assumed dragon mages, and I guess myself included now, would become stronger over time. Yes and no, said Francel. You can have a 50-year-old elf with a 10-year bond to their dragon easily outclass a 600-year-old elf who's just gained a bond in every aspect of magic. Thinking about it jarred Auric's morning brain. He looked down at the hatchling again, which sat still, wagging his tail like a dog. Auric couldn't help but chuckle. Another shift in mood came through the bond. Yeah, you're always hungry. I am too this time, though. Just something to think about, said Francel. Most of the torches diminished throughout the night, so we'll just get a move on. However, caution. Make the damn perimeter flares last all night next time. Auric scoffed. Next time I'll find some shit to roll them around in. Perhaps some dead leaves to buff up the resin. You see, Francel said, pointing at Auric as he grinned. You're not as dumb as you look. Auric ignored the captain as he knelt down and held his hand out. The hatchling pressed his forehead into Auric's palm. I'll get some food on the way. The journey to Direhallow spent most of the day. The sun was creeping down over the canopy of the evergreen by the time they reached the clearing and sanded road. They paused before venturing out into the pathway, hunkering down behind a thick spruce. Right, I'll go in first, said Francel. So far as anyone is concerned, I still hold the rank of Sentinel Captain of the Elven Court. The title alone will allot me the horses and food, if King Paulus still has any overreach here. And if he doesn't? Auric questioned. Francel looked down. Then we could have bigger problems. They hate outsiders almost as much as they hate elves. He looked at the dragon. Unfortunately, with him, you're not going to be able to hide him. Auric looked down and grinned awkwardly at the hatchling. I don't think so. Nor do I think he'll stay put. Francel cuffed Auric on the back of the head. Never, ever let him leave your sight. That's rule 1. You know what he means for the elves. For humans, he has a lifetime's worth of coin. Auric quirked a brow as he rubbed the back of his head. Are we setting official rules now?
If you insist on acting as a child would, then yes, said Francel. No, they may find us some moits, rations and cloaks. We'll set off and meet camp a few leagues southwest of here. Yeah?
Auric nodded, keeping the idea to himself that he hated Francel going into Direhallow by himself. It was moot to be spoken. Just be careful. And quick.